Our new story begins with a big explosion at Naruto Academy. Our protagonist shot to the ground as a guy with green hair teased him that he hadn't even noticed he was there. This enigmatic character asked him if he really had just been hit by elemental magic and sarcastically praised him, saying he was fucking incredible, while Naruto struggled to his feet shattered. When he finally got up, he complained to the guy if it wasn't enough and demanded that he return what he was promised, since he had brought what the guy asked for. He lifted the bag of food and announced to everyone that it was the famous fresh sirloin burger. The famous school lunch, limited to only 50 pieces sold per day, confirmed that he had brought enough for everyone, but the green-haired man asked him where the drink was. The guy said he should have been more considerate. Then, releasing a fireball in his hand, he threw it at her while shouting that as punishment for not bringing drinks he should have another portion. It hit him and knocked him to the ground. Once again, Naruto stood up again while the men mockingly told him that as they expected he was exceptionally weak. Suddenly, an angry woman asked them what they were doing. The men noticed that he was Shinonome and they all knew that he was on the disciplinary committee. The man then threw his cell phone in her face while yelling at her that he should be grateful that that was all he had for that day. The phone cracked as it hit the floor. Shinonome ran to him worriedly as she picked up her phone. She asked if she was okay, but he told her to stop doing it and that she would also be excluded if she associated with him. Sadly, she told him that she didn't care, but he told her angrily that they couldn't survive in that place if they got together like they did when they were little. Then he walked away, leaving her calling his name sadly. He entered the building and the students whispered that he was the special admission student, asking how he had managed to enter such a prestigious school when he had no magical ability whatsoever. They also whispered that they had heard there was a mistake in the scoring system and wondered if he had cheated on the exam. Although Haruto didn't want to admit it, he couldn't deny the rumors that questioned how a mediocre student like him had entered that prestigious school one day out of nowhere. His parents suddenly informed him of his admission as a special admission student, and although he would have liked to ask them because it was too late, he looked up at the sky and wondered if perhaps he should have died with them. That day, Naruto was admitted to the school without any magical ability, so he could not specialize in the wizard course. Consequently, he was forced to become a swordsman, and in today's society, where magic is overwhelmingly dominant, he was considered useless, only capable of fighting in hand-to-hand combat. Being the sole survivor of his family and a constant burden on dungeon raids, he was nicknamed the God of Plagues. After his class, he returned to his apartment building and opened the door, but before entering he noticed a letter on his door. He sat holding the letter and noticed that it had no stamp or sender's name, but decided to open it. Anyway, when he removed the sealed label, he was surprised to see a powerful light emanating from it. The light enveloped him while he was in Sochi. Eventually the letter dragged him inside, opened his eyes and found his surroundings colorful, which made him anxiously ask where the water he stepped on was. It parted, and a shadow emerged. The shadow, smiling, told him that it was the year 2054 according to the Western calendar, and asked if it was really Corporal Garuto, 16 years old, to which he responded, stammering that, yes. The shadow told him that his name was Boxaruto, and that he was the same from the future. He explained that he was sending the letter from the future, and that in 10 years he would become a magician capable of manipulating space and time. However, waiting that long was too long, so she decided to train him right there to become a great wizard of space and time. Naruto looked into the shadow, wondering what the man, his future self, was saying. He told her he knew he was skeptical because he was him. But he insisted that a picture is worth more than 1,000 words, and only once should he do what he told him, his future. Then he instructed him to enter the rank dungeon. F.A. Shinjuku Imperial Garden alone, and said that he would talk to him again after he had done the shadow. Then he disappeared. A moment later he entered the Imperial Garden of Shinjuku, a rank dungeon, F.E. I knew a clear dungeon like this really didn't have anything worth taking. Then he told his future self that if this was some kind of joke, he should know what was going to happen. His future self replied that he could burn and tear the letter as he pleased and instructed him to go straight and turn right. Finally, gritting his teeth in frustration, he followed the directions and a moment later he came across a wall. He told his future self that he had reached a dead end and asked if he could burn it now, but his future self just told him to put the letter in the slot in the wall. He sighed and inserted the letter into the slot. To his surprise, the slot lit up and the wall moved to one side, creating enough space for him to pass through. He went in. I've never heard of such a thing as a hidden route. Suddenly, something bright lit up the dark hidden space and then he saw a huge crystal bound by a chain of his from the future. He told her it was a skill cube and asked if it was the first time he saw one of his from the future. Then he ordered him to touch it and acquire the ability. He approached it with apprehension and touched it, but then his future apologized to him. Suddenly, the ability bucket cracked and then turned red. A purple light appeared around the skill bucket and a hole was opened over it. It began to absorb the blocks around it and began to form something in the air. When he finished absorbing the blocks at high speed and forming the object, the smoke slowly dissipated, revealing an enormous shape in front of him. He was stunned with horror when he saw glowing eyes and then a golem leapt toward him. She looked at him with her one bright eye and he wondered if he really was a golem. But then she attacked him swiftly, hitting him and hurling him away, aching, blurred-eyed. He wondered what was going on and if he had been ripped off, suffering serious injuries. He felt hot and realized that his whole body was burning. He felt his consciousness fade and wondered if he was going to die. Then he looked at his phone, saw images of his mother, father, and little sister Ria, and told them that he could finally be with the rest of them. But then the letter lit up and his future asked him if he was okay. She reminded him that he was a failure at the school where his parents had enrolled him, and that he was going to die a senseless death after being ripped off by him. Then she asked him if he was really okay with that, which brought him back to consciousness. He remembered his miserable life where nothing good ever happened. However, he realized that it was only his life and he had convinced himself that this was the way it should be, so he had given up. He replied that he would not be okay with that in any way and told her that if that was the case, she should resist, survive with resilience and change her miserable life. When the Bulan attack was about to hit him, he didn't avoid it and was killed, but he still managed to tell Defiant not to mess with him in a place like this. Suddenly, the system showed a hidden mission in the Imperial Garden of Shinjuku. A 5-rank dungeon had met the requirement for the indomitable spirit of the Wizard of Space and Time. Therefore, his adventurous death was cancelled and his physical body would experience a setback. Then he opened his eyes, confident that he would survive. When he met the requirements, the skill cube broke into pieces, unleashing a powerful force that headed directly towards where he was lying. The powerful blow struck him directly and in the golem's eyes, he was standing. His body was imbued with a strong electrified energy. The system then showed that it had acquired magic, temporal space along with swift body, material rewind, and detention chain. It also indicated that he had obtained the passive ability of the Time-Space Wizard. Awakened potential level 1.1 increased by 30%. However, he just looked at her hand and asked, "What the hell is this? His me?" Del Futuro explained that taking a shortcut to his awakening required potentially fatal and difficult conditions, then apologized for not informing him. He previously revealed that space-time magic would not be discovered for another 10 years, because it was part of a hidden mission that until now only he had found. He asked his future self if he really was from the future, but his future self simply told him that he seemed alive now and that the tutorial was about to begin while the golem behind him was ready to crush him. When the golem launched an attack, he felt it and immediately looked back, managing to leap in time to dodge the golem's hand. Then he noticed that his body felt light, making him wonder if it was the effect of the passive ability. His future self told him that he would teach him how a space-time wizard should fight and that he shouldn't use his eyes to see but just feel it. The flow of time that rules the world followed the order, and his future self proudly told him that he absolutely could because it was him after all. The golem threw its huge fist at him, but he didn't move and tried to concentrate, feeling the flow of time. When the golem's fist was inches away, he opened his eyes. He looked into the golem's eyes and jumped away in time to dodge it. Then he activated his time-space magic and landed in the golem's hand. Using his swift body, he jumped in front of the golem. He ran up the golem's arm, and when he reached the top, he threw his sword at the golem's head while telling it to make its core. Then he drove his sword into the golem's head and thrust with all his might, cracking the core inside its head. Gradually, the golem's head cracked even more until it exploded into pieces. He dropped to the ground and walked away, the golem's body crumbling behind him. After defeating the golem, his level increased by 4, his swordsman's skill by 8, and he earned 45,800 credits. As he looked at his system from the future, he asked if he believed him now and called him God of Plagues. He grabbed his sword tightly and responded that something like that was true. His future self then told him that for the next necessary step he should leave the dungeon. He asked his future self if there was still anything left to do, to which his future self replied yes, and that there was only one small matter for him to resolve. They were going to where Shinonome would be killed by a monster. Today he stopped to hear this and was surprised to realize what had been said. Then he asked his future self to repeat what he had said. His future explained that it was her childhood friend Shinonome, who along with some friends would enter Kabukuro's ranked dungeon today and be killed by the extra boss. Monster positioned his feet as his from the future urged him to save Shinonome and change his future from the future. He then called him a mage of space and time, as he ran out of the dungeon while running. His from the future told him that on May 23, 2054. In the Western calendar, in the deepest part of the ranked dungeon of Kabukuru, the unexpected appearance of an extra rank boss would result in the death of Shinonome Rim around, so they were completely annihilated. Although Shinonome was not entirely guilty, before his future self could say more, he shouted at her to shut up. A moment later he arrived at Kabukuru's ranked dungeon, exhausted. He asked his future self because he had not said anything before, but he only asked him if he wasn't the one who had wanted to avoid interacting with others, because anyone he met would have bad luck. She reminded him that that was also why he was quite comfortable being ignored, and asked him why he was so angry for the sake of others. He was suddenly stopped by a momentary pause as the gables surrounded him, but his future self told him to stop acting as if he had suddenly been enlightened. He grabbed his sword from behind. So when the Gavins leapt together to attack him, they were quickly cut off by their future. I told him that the world could change because of his actions, but he just told him to shut up and that he would do whatever he wanted, his future. I replied that I understood and that that was the answer I was looking for. As a reward I would teach him an application of space-time magic. Meanwhile, on the deepest floor a huge explosion was heard along with screams and without a gnome. It was thrown into the air. She crashed to the ground as her friends watched in horror. They called her urgently, but she couldn't get up because of the pain. When he opened his eyes, he gave the extra C-rank chief, Dark Sentinel. In front of them, a man shouted that they had not been informed about it, and a woman who was trying to ask for help screamed in panic that it was useless because there was no response to the rescue spell. Another woman urged them to calm down, and told them that if they all attacked at once they had a chance to win. But the man hesitantly said no, that he couldn't do it and that he didn't want to die. Dark Sentinel lit his huge sword as the woman shouted at the man that this was no time to say such a thing. But then Dark Sentinel swung his sword at them and struck them all, throwing them into the air together. Shinonome managed to sit up and was surprised to see all his friends on the floor. Many had collapsed, but then he saw that one of his friends was still alive and begging for help, so he got up and attacked Dark Sentinel. With his firepower, he managed to hit him in the head, but he didn't even scratch the sentry, leaving her stunned and horrified. Dark Sentinel, he raised his sword, and as he lunged at her, he closed his eyes, crying and screamed for help. Fortunately, he appeared just in time and used his stopping ability to stop Dark Sentinel's attack. Then he asked if he was all right. She opened her eyes in surprise to see him there, but he simply confronted Dark Sentinel and told her to stay away. He deactivated his stopping ability, grabbed his sword from behind, and leaped to dodge Dark Sentinel's sword. Then she leapt behind him, and when she quickly turned to attack him, she again blocked his attack with her sword and tried to compete with him as best she could. Unfortunately, his sword broke under the force. Dark Sentinel looked at him angrily, making him curse under his breath. Then she gathered power from her eyes and aimed at him. Unleashing a strong explosion with her fast movement ability, she walked away and appeared behind him. Knowing that his sword did not work in his armor, but partly uncovered, he realized that he had to focus on his head. Dark Sentinel turned and immediately threw his broken sword at his head, his future. I reminded him that his sword was going to break, but he simply replied that he knew it. He then used his material recoil ability, and as his sword began to repair itself, he hurled it towards the head of Dark Sentinel, who was accumulating power. Again, the tip of his sword struck the Dark Sentinel's eye just in time, piercing through the helmet. The head went limp and he landed safely on the ground. His future self then told him that it seemed that fate itself had changed, while Inanome looked at him in surprise and confusion. A moment later, Sina didn't rush to me asking what the hell was going on and demanding that he explain, but decided to thank him first for saving her and her friends. He told her not to worry about it and begged her to keep it a secret for now. She thought for a moment and asked, "Yes?" In other words, that would be a secret just between the two of them. He replied, confused, that yes, that it would be so. She smiled at him and then asked him where he got his strength from. Before he was about to respond when his future self told him that he wanted to keep possible future ramifications to a minimum and refrained from making careless comments about magic. Time-space paused as he listened to his future self, but asked Shinonome if she too could keep what he was about to tell him a secret. She looked at him confused, but explained that there was a lot going on and she didn't want to stand out. Her future self then suggested that she should somehow deceive her. Shinonome heard it and asked if the voice she had just heard was her own. Surprised, he replied that it wasn't him at all and that he didn't know what he was talking about. Then he glared at the letter and swore to kill his future. I later sighed for it and told Shinonome that I wanted to try a special swordsmanship skill that I had been practicing, but since it was not yet complete, it was not something to tell everyone. She smiled and said she understood, and if that was the case, she would keep it a secret, making him sigh in relief, knowing that she had somehow managed to fool her. Thus, Shinonome Ring's supposed destined death was averted, and at the same time, Haruto was able to obtain overwhelming magic and power. Naruto knew he couldn't change the past, but he could continue to change what was to come. Suddenly someone called him the God of Plagues, and when he turned around he saw the bully at the door, calling and laughing, mockingly. A moment later, a man told him that he had heard that he had entered Ayukuro's dungeon yesterday, and a guy he saw told him that he just ran home, helpless, unable to be of any use. Another man told him mockingly that it looked like they even ran into an extra boss and had to take a training session with him, which made them laugh. The man asked his friends, and it was to be expected from the God of Plagues, but Naruto only wondered who the witness was. In addition to Shinano, the man told him that a friend of his was also there and ended up being taken to the hospital with serious injuries, so hospitalization expenses would be high. The man then made a gesture to ask for money and asked if he understood what he meant by that. Then he demanded that I pay there in exchange, they wouldn't tell anyone. The men then asked him what he had to say about it, but he remained silent, angering them and causing them to demand that he say something. The man then conjured fire in his hand and reminded him that he would become his target for practicing attack spells. Again he shouted that he had had enough, which made the man stretch out his hands angrily, and ask him to repeat what he had just said. Defiantly, he repeated that he had had enough and asked them if they were dumb trash, which enraged the man and his companions. They launched an attack on the angry while calling him a bastard, but he was grateful for his increased stats, as he could clearly see the scoundrel's movements. Then he attacked them quickly, one by one, stopping behind them. They all looked around in horror, wondering what was going on. He told them to listen carefully and warned them not to come near him ever again. Or else, the same thing would happen. He had his wallets and a lighter. One of the men shouted that those wallets were his, but he simply lit the lighter and told them it was a promise between them, and he then seriously asked them what they were saying, to which they all nodded in fear. After that they all fled. He thought they wouldn't mess with him anymore and decided to return to his class. A moment later he was sitting in class, noticing that his next class was measurement of magical ability. The teacher announced that he would begin the magical ability measurement for that semester immediately and called his name. He replied that if he got up to walk to the front, he knew that his intrinsic magical ability was almost zero. But wondering how things would turn out now that he was a time-space wizard, he decided to try to pour some time-space magic into the mirror. As proof, he placed his hand on the mirror and infused temporal space with his magic. After that, he opened his eyes and the teacher was stunned in confusion when a bright light flowed from the mirror. Suddenly, the mirror exploded and shattered, causing the teacher to fall to the ground and leaving the students in shock. He realized he shouldn't have done something so dramatic because it made him stand out unnecessarily. While in the background, Shinonome laughed after school. As he left the building he heard students whispering, wondering if it was the god of plague who had destroyed the measuring device. They murmured that further inspection revealed that it was an unknown form of magic, but other students couldn't believe it, knowing that if it were true, it would be above a grade. He thought about how different this gossip was from what he used to hear and felt it was much more exhausting. Suddenly someone called to him, so he looked around confused at the voice. Then she called him to the bushes and what emerged made him gasp in surprise. The fluffy stuffed animal spoke to him and recognized the voice, asking if it was the hymn of the letter and what passed with its shape. His future self replied that it was a type of magic, temporal space that had possessed the stuffed animal in his house. He asked his future yo if this explained everything, but his future yo only stated that it was an emergency, since the Chaos Dragon had appeared earlier than expected in the future he knew. He asked his future what I meant by Chaos Dragon and his future. I explained that it was bad news because I had destroyed the guild of adventurers in the Ariake area, which resulted in many casualties. He also caused unprecedented catastrophe and was a monster categorized as an alpha-type extermination target, just like in his future self emphasized that since he appeared earlier than expected, they had to defeat him. Whatever happens, he told his future self that if they didn't do it the catastrophic events would repeat themselves, to which his future self agreed, confirming that it was just as it had been in his future. Stunned by the revelation, he shouted to his future self that if that was the case, they had to contact the Adventurer Guild and request an extermination team, because with a squad of high-ranking adventurers, even the Chaos Dragon would be more manageable. However, his future self just looked at him, declaring that they couldn't do it because time had run out. Suddenly he heard something massive approaching from above. When he looked up, he was stunned to see the Chaos Dragon flying over them. He asked his future self if the dragon wasn't supposed to be confined to a dungeon, but his future self replied that it was a ferocious migratory species, unlikely to stay in one place. As the dragon flew past them, he cursed in panic, knowing that if he continued on his way, the school would suffer casualties. The students who had been peacefully leaving the school and chatting animatedly stopped abruptly as darkness enveloped their surroundings. They looked up, horrified at the dragon flying over them, frozen, Sensoki, wondering why he was there. The dragon stared at them and dived towards the ground, inciting them to flee. Back in the safety of the school terrified, a lady shouted for everyone to prepare for battle and instructed the non-mage students to quickly evacuate to the school dormitories. Meanwhile, the wizards took their positions. He ran after the dragon, shouting to indicate that the anti-students were the magical security guards of the student council. The students formed a magic circle and pointed it at the dragon looming over them. They began to attack the dragon with their magical powers, and the lady in front raised her cane, ordering her team not to allow the dragon near the school grounds. He then threw a massive magic circle over the dragon and unleashed an attack that resulted in an explosion. Her team proudly thought they had him subdued, and she smiled when they praised her, but her smile turned to shock when she heard the dragon growl in anger. To their dismay, they realized that their attacks had no effect. He was immune to anti-dragon magic bullets. The dragon then accumulated power in his mouth and launched a devastating attack towards the student council mages. The attack hit them directly without giving them time to escape and caused massive destruction on the ground. In an instant, the student council's magical security guards were out of action. His future self commented that this was to be expected, since they were only student mages. He shouted at his future self that now was not the time for such comments, but his future self simply called his name, and before he could look, he threw something at his head. He asked his self about the future he was making, and the answer was that it was dragon incense, an aroma that attracts dragons. His future self explained that the dragon, being a ferocious migratory species with little intelligence, would now pursue him alone. The dragon then dove toward him, ready to attack, but his future self sternly told him that he had to confront him and show them the power of a wizard. Temporal space. The dragon looked at him angrily, and his future self shouted that he was approaching and urged him to run, which he did. Suddenly, he heard someone ask if they were all right. Turning, surprised, he saw Shinonome helping the students. His future self asked him if he really wanted to keep Shinonome out of this problem, to which his future self answered affirmatively. He then advised her that the best option would be to run, suggesting that this would minimize the risk of witnesses to her battle. Using his quick movement ability, he walked away with the dragon closely following him. A moment later, he arrived at the Tokyo City train station. Junior Nekano, his future self, informed him that the train yard was currently deserted and instructed him to jump over the fence to attract the Chaos Dragon, which he did quickly. Once they were on the other side and waiting for the dragon, he asked his future self about the dragon's characteristics. His future self explained that the dragon belonged to the dark element, possessed a very powerful dragon breath, which meant instant death if confronted directly, and emitted a miasma that caused a delay effect. In addition, it had resistance to physical attack, which meant it was impervious to damage from careless attacks. He asked his future self if this meant he was an absolute monster 5 years in the future, to which his future self confirmed that it was true. However, he added that the dragon was still a juvenile with little intelligence, which made him susceptible to dragon incense. He nodded in understanding, but when his future self mentioned that the incense cost 500,000 credits, he was surprised and asked if his future self really meant 500,000. His future self affirmed the cost and mentioned withdrawing it from his bank account, which made him grab his future self in Sochi. Demanding to know how he knew his PIN number, his future self did not respond, which made him curse in frustration. His future self reassured him by telling him not to worry, promising him that he would easily recover such a small sum and that defeating the dragon would bring a substantial reward. Furthermore, he emphasized that money was simply icing on the cake. The real prize would be the skill bucket that the dragon dropped, that would grant him a new magic spell. Temporal space. His from the future then returned to the task in question, explaining that the Chaos Dragon had not yet reached its mature form, so its weak point, the dragon core, would be exposed. When his from the future was about to reveal the location of the dragon's core, the dragon appeared above them, growling menacingly. he launched a powerful attack at them, but fortunately they both jumped aside just in time to dodge him, while he gathered power in his mouth. Once again, he grabbed his sword as his future self yelled a sarcastic warning, thanked his future self for the useless advice, and then deftly dodged the dragon's multiple attacks thanks to his quick movement spell. When the barrage of attacks ceased, he stopped and informed his future self that he was ducking behind him, that he somehow managed to evade them. However, he was taken by surprise, when another attack flew straight at him and hit him, making him scream in pain. As an explosion exploded from impact through the fog, the dragon felt a blue light emerge. Surprised, the dragon did not see him rush towards her as he proclaimed that he was from 0.5 seconds ago his from the future, he observed in amazement. Wondering if he had just invented a practical application of space-time magic in the heat of the moment. Then he lunged for the dragon's core, and when he saw it he was sure it was the target. He slammed his sword with all his strength against the dragon's core but felt no connection to his blow, leaving him perplexed. Suddenly, the core released power and the dragon began to fade. Before his eyes it landed. Commenting to his future self that he had not been warned about this ability, which caused his future self to remember and explain that the Chaos Dragon could transform his entire body into miasma, advising him to be careful during attacks, he sighed and told his future self that next time he should share such crucial information before a fight, as his future self warned. The dragon could also materialize miasma to create an army of small dragon-like figures, known as a legion. True to his future self's warning, the Chaos Dragon released these little figures around him, making him question whether he was really only juvenile. Then he assumed it could not be treated by ordinary means. His future self told him that originally this difficult enemy wasn't supposed to appear until 5 years from now. He asked his future self why such a monster was appearing now, and the answer was that it could be because he was altering the future, so he should take responsibility and defeat the dragon properly. He sighed in frustration and asked if his future self meant it was all his fault. Suddenly, one of the little dragons tried to take him down, but luckily he used his quick body spell in time and jumped away. Another little dragon pounced on him, and he cut him in half with his sword. Then he saw that it was gone, which made him feel relieved because it proved that these little dragons don't turn into miasma. When he hits them, his future self told him to disperse the little ones and wait for their chance to attack, but he shouted at him that he would do the same, even without being told. Then he boosted his foot and aimed at his target. He leapt with speed, cutting every little dragon that flew in the air, trying to kill them quickly to conserve energy. A moment later, his future self noticed that he had defeated all the little dragons and that his level had increased by 3. But exhausted and panting, he asked his future self if the Chaos Dragon had run out of little dragons. Suddenly, the dragon reappeared in front of him and spat out another attack. He was stunned and jumped away just as the attack was about to hit him. Then he saw it explode, destroying the ground. He narrowly avoided being caught in the explosion. The dragon gathered power in his mouth again and he was shocked to see it attack once again. He quickly ran from his position to avoid the next attack. Noticing how the hallway melted with the dragon's power, he realized that he had fought the small fires and used too much resistance, now reaching his limits. He knew he would have to wait a few more minutes before he could push himself hard and somehow hit his weakness. The dragon core ran towards the dragon, but stopped abruptly when he saw it fly higher. His from the future, smiling, told him that his attacks would not reach him from being so high. He growled in frustration, cursing to himself as he wondered what to do next, looking around, looking for something that could help. His eyes fell on unused containers and trains, which gave him an idea. He thought that if he executed his plan he could get closer to the dragon. His future self asked him what he planned to do, pointing out that the situation was getting more desperate by the second. Ignoring caution, he grabbed the stuffed animal and dragged it as he ran. then he leaped over the containers and toward a pole. His future self shouted that even from that height, he still couldn't reach the dragon, to which he replied that he knew. He swung the stuffed animal back to gain momentum. Then he threw it hard at the dragon, startling his future self. Then he cast his chain of arrest spell on the stuffed animal. After that he leapt toward the stuffed animal and then onto the dragon, making his future self scream in disbelief. He shouted at the dragon that he would not allow it to transform into miasma again, and used his arrest chain spell to grab the dragon. He knew an enemy like that couldn't be held back for more than a few seconds, but that was all he needed. He pushed his sword into the dragon's core, fighting because it was extremely hard. He felt his chain disappearing, so he pushed his sword with all his strength toward the core. When the restraining chain broke, releasing the dragon, he channeled all his magical power into the sword, shattering the dragon's core. He screamed in pain and fortunately the core cracked and then exploded, while the plush fell face down on the ground. 1 minute later he emerged from the smoke with a broken sword, but triumphant had managed to defeat the Chaos Dragon on his own. The dead dragon slowly disappeared, and the system showed that his level had increased by 15, his Chinese sword skill by 28, and he had obtained 872,300 credits. He also obtained a material, the Chaos Dragon Fang. The system then advised him to check the upgrade options for the adventurer rank and recommended visiting the nearest adventurer guild. His future self told him that he had also done as expected. However, he used it as a springboard to get angry. His future self asked him what it meant, but he simply ignored it while he looked at the system. The system then showed that his secret ability time-space magic had increased by 20 levels, and his rewind and quick body abilities had increased by 2 levels each. His temporal space mage passive ability had also been increased by 2 levels and gained 50% unleashed potential. His future self told him that they had managed to prevent a catastrophic event from happening again in the future, so he assumed that was fine and that they had achieved what they wanted. Suddenly, their future self heard something approaching and warned it that it looked like someone had reported the incident, which could be bad for them if discovered. His from the future then jumped on his shoulder and told him they were leaving. Now he told his future friend that it was rare for them to agree on anything. Then he jumped inside the fence and hurried toward his apartment building. Once inside, he grabbed some food and opened it, remembering something. Then he asked his future self if he needed to eat. Not at all, to which his future self replied that there was no way a stuffed animal would be able to eat and told him to try to use common sense to figure things out. I retort that common sense was used. A stuffed animal that could talk was much crazier. Just as he was about to eat, he remembered something he needed to do that he had almost forgotten, so he stood up and walked to his small desk. He then poured a drink into the cup and placed it in front of his family photo as he told his mother, father and younger sister, Ria, that he was home. His future self looked at him in silence and he told him not to make fun of him for doing so. His future self replied that he wouldn't because he was him after all. He then decided to omit it from Ria for now and keep it a secret because it was still too soon for her to know, and swore he would tell her when he grew up as a space-time wizard. He then tells his future self that he just obtained a weapon material that is the Chaos Dragon Tusk. His future self tells him that his sword is already falling apart and won't withstand another battle, so it's the perfect timing. His future self also suggests taking a break from school tomorrow to go do weapon synthesis. The next day they arrive at the Shinjuku Metropolitan Government Office branch of the Adventurers Guild. He tells his future self that he used to think that place had nothing to offer a weak, small-time adventurer like him. His future self smiles proudly and tells him that all of this is now possible because of him, but he just walks into the building telling his future self that, as soon as they finish their business there, they will go home and that he shouldn't wander around anywhere. Only inside the reception lobby does he hear an announcement indicating that the person with the number 23 must go to the reception desk. That it was his turn. he approaches the counter and the lady asks him the purpose of his visit. Today he responds that he has finished conquering a dungeon and would like her to verify his results. He then gives his card to the lady, who, although she initially thinks he appears to be just a common weak adventurer, takes his card and tells her to let him take a look at his adventurer card. The lady inserts the card into her system. When the system reads the card, a panel appears in front of him. She tells him that they need to confirm his identity, so he should place his hand on the panel and they can verify his results. Then he places the palm of his hand on the panel, as instructed, and the lady begins to verify his results. However, she is shocked to discover that she has risen from rank to rank in just one day, which seems impossible to her by stuttering. The lady exclaims that it is so strange and asks if there is any malfunction in the terminal. When you notice people looking at you. Because of the lady's action, he realizes that he was bad, and if things continued like this, he would stand out too much, something he absolutely detested, as he hated dealing with problematic situations. After using his material rewind ability on the system, he told the lady with his back to him that the system had finished authenticating his identity. The lady checked the system again and saw that her rank was E, which confused her and led her to ask what was going on. He asked the lady if anything was wrong, but she stammered that there was nothing wrong and that she would return her card. Thinking about how strange the situation was, he took his card and thanked the lady. After he left, the system returned to its original state, which was rank C. His future self congratulated him for cleverly applying rewinding to the screen, commenting that they needed to keep their future paths from diverging as much as possible. A few minutes later they arrived in front of the elevator and he asked his future self if this was his destination. His future self confirmed that he did tell him to enter the elevator. He did so and waited for the doors to open. When the elevator doors opened, he realized they were on Rango's floor. He told his future self that they couldn't get in unless they were A rank, but his future self just told him to forget it, and then it turned into a letter. He looked at the letter, puzzled by the situation, but his future self ordered him to hold it in front of the scanner. He reminded his future self that they were in a high security area, but his future self insisted that he just follow the instructions. He complied and scanned the letter into the scanner. Then the range door opened and he stepped in. While his from the future, he told him that they should start synthesizing a weapon suitable for a space-time wizard immediately, making him smile. Excited, Kant Yan looked at his future, eye with a mixture of astonishment and confusion. "So there's no excursion today?" he asked, noticing a man typing his future on a nearby computer. I told him no, that instead they were there to request the synthesis of a weapon. The man, who turned out to be the head of the weapons synthesis laboratory, Shirayama Takimune, stood up and looked at him suspiciously. "Are you an adventurer with at least one rating range?" she asked, assessing him. "You look more like a student of rank. If you tricked security into getting in here." His future. I whispered to him that he will show that thing. Kant John took the dragon fang from chaos and explained that it was a rare material obtained from a formidable enemy. If the flame examined it closely, recognizing its quality, "Did you marry this yourself?" he asked, to which Kanjan replied in the affirmative. If the flame inspected his sword as he nodded. After accessing something on his smart watch, he activated a device in the center of the room. "This is Japan's most advanced synthesis device," he explained. "The analytical results of the Chaos Dragon Fang aren't even recorded in the guild's database. I will use this opportunity for studies and let you use the device for free. Call me when you finish the song." He put his backpack on the ground while his future. I mentioned that I had never done weapon synthesis, so I would show him a system interface. She appeared in front of him, indicating that they were not allowed to take the synthesis course at the academy unless they were rank B or higher. He entered the machine while his future self explained the 4 steps of synthesis. First, choosing the base weapon, which in his case would be the sword loaned by the academy. Second, deciding the attribute to imbue, and since his sword was rank F, it only had 1 attribute slot. Third, select the enchantment material, which would be the Chaos Dragon Fang. Finally came the time for Kant synthesis. John inserted the sword into the machine and selected the element of light, as suggested by his future self. Then he placed the Chaos Dragon tusk in the appropriate compartment and closed the machine. He decided the forging time, and although his future I suggested 3 years, he complained that he couldn't wait that long. However, he followed the instructions. Suddenly his future self jumped into the machine, causing an explosion of power. The machine thanked the wait and announced the completion of the synthesis, revealing a sword of chaos with attribute of light and rank to its future. I reappeared exhausted, but confirming that the synthesis was real and complete. Kantchen, incredulous, asked if it was really finished, to which his future already nodded, adding that this process could not be repeated often. Shirayama was astonished, unable to believe that a 3-year-old forge was completed in seconds. In a hurry, Kanjon thanked Shirayama and prepared to leave. As he walked, he overheard an intriguing conversation about an anonymous rumor. One man was talking about how a ferocious migratory species was killed instantly. And his friend speculated that if its identity was known, it would trigger a recruitment battle between famous clans. This made Count Leon think that they should leave immediately, but his future, me now turned into a stuffed animal again, disagreed. And he suggested testing the sword in a place where the sacred beast Cerberus resides. Count Leon, horrified, asked if he really mentioned Cerberus just then, otherwise he did not appear in front of him, calling him with tears in his eyes. He explained that he was told that the monster that attacked the school was looking for him and that he had been sending him messages without response. Count John apologized for worrying her, and when she noticed the plush she found it adorable and hugged it, saying it smelled like him, which gave her peace of mind. He, seeing an opportunity, told her that he could keep the stuffed animal for a while, which surprised his future. If not, he didn't thank me. And as he walked away, she dismissed him with a smile. His future self, angry, shouted that he would not leave him there. But Count John moved on the next day in the Adventurer Cultivation Agency. His future I was still upset. Count Jan reminded her that she immediately went back to look for him, and her future self expressed her gratitude for allowing her to see her childhood friend again. However, someone was watching us from above, recognizing him as Kaleo Arudo, the so-called god of plagues. The mysterious man decided to make Kanjon his next target, intrigued by his ability to slay dragons. Meanwhile, in the student counseling office, someone was banging furiously on the desk. The vice president of the student council, Sakura Kurgi Yusuke, asked Aruto if he really didn't know anything about what happened. He shook his head, and Yusuke explained to him that the day before yesterday, when the ferocious migratory creatures attacked after class, he heard that he ran in the same direction as the beast. Haruto responded that the monster changed focus halfway, focusing its attention on another student, and disappeared. He assured him that it was another boy who defeated him and that it was a very close encounter for him. Yuzuki wanted to know if he knew the identity of the student who defeated the monster. Haruto shook his head again, explaining that he was too focused on escaping. She sighed and told him she understood. He went to the door announcing that he was leaving because class was about to start. Yuzuki tried to stop him, but he left the classroom wondering why they suspected him. His future replied that it was probably because of the live video that showed him jumping towards the dragon and killing it instantly. Naruto asked his future self if they could prevent the video from going public using space-time magic. But his future self replied that it was impossible with his current abilities. Haruto sighed and headed to his classroom, surprised to hear his classmates muttering, but he walked directly to his seat. One of his classmates commented that things were finally going to start. Haruto sat down thinking that they were already avoiding him in class. But today he felt different at that moment. If not, he didn't appear in front of me shouting that I should be careful and get away. Someone told Shinonome that he didn't need to tell Aruto, a third-year student in the high school division and president of the student council. His Mirage and Raduga stepped in and told Synonym that he would take care of it. He introduced himself as his Mirage and Ryuga, the president of the student council and the genius wizard who reigned at the top of the school hierarchy, being the strongest in the school. Ryuga asked Naruto if it was Kajaoruto, and he replied yes. Ryuga told him he was coming to request a magical duel. His companions began to whisper and mock him thinking he was finished, but Naruto looked seriously at Ryuga, who smiled at him. Ryuga told him that a loser like him, with zero magical ability, had destroyed the device used to measure a magician's magical ability. Traces of an unknown substance were found at the scene and he had also annihilated that fierce chaos dragon, the Solo. Naruto wondered how Ryuga knew all this, but Ryuga just told him that it was very interesting and that they had to cut the problem in the bud before it grew, which made Naruto look at him angrily. Ryuga declared that the truth would be revealed, adding that he had also defeated a lone dragon, therefore, they had to decide in a magical duel who deserved the title of Dragon Slayer. Naruto knew that a magical duel was a special test sanctioned and facilitated by the Adventurer Cultivation Agency, conducted among students to evaluate their actual strengths. The results of these duels determined the ranking of students within the school. Students at the top of the ranking obtained various privileges within the school and were considered on their way to becoming officers of the Adventurers Guild upon graduation. The only rule in these duels was not to use any magic or spell that could result in death, permanent injury, or side effects. The participants in a duel were established at the request and discretion of the party with the lowest rank, who also had the right to nominate a desired opponent of higher rank. Naruto also knew that in a grief request, the person with the highest rank must always accept, but the person with the lowest rank could reject. In other words, I thought there was no way in hell I was going to accept a duel with the number one student in the school rankings. Raduga. Then he told Synonym that he should think more carefully about who he associated with if he aspired to become a member of the student council. The next term looked her up and down, suggesting that they take the next opportunity to make her understand this up close and personal. He added that he would teach her what it takes to join the student council as well. Synonym accepted awkwardly, and thanked Ryuga for his guidance in advance. Ryuga smiled at the frightened Synonym, causing Haruto to clench his fists in anger. He got up and called Ryuga saying that he would accept the challenge of the duel, surprising Shinonome. Ryuga was about to say something when Haruto added that he had a condition. Ryuga asked what it was. Naruto replied that the loser should leave the academy. Ryuga smiled, turned around and responded that he gladly accepted and that now it was too late for Haruto to regret his words. During the recess, Haruto was eating when his future self told him that she had a rather sharp tongue, and that she looked more and more like him. His future self warned him that Ryuga was strong. Haruto asked if he knew him, to which his future self nodded and told him that Ryuga would become the head of the Shinjuku branch of the Adventurers Guild. Ryuga would invent many new spells related to the fire element and would become one of the 7 wise men. Naruto scoffed that he sounded more like a fool than a wise man. His future self agreed, saying that Ryuga's character and nature were the personification of meanness. From that moment on, Ryuga would use his position to exploit countless women under his command, confirming to Haruto that Ryuga was a jerk. His future self went on to explain that Ryuga was also skilled at gathering followers. His certainty that Haruto was the so-called Dragon Slayer probably came from information provided by students in his faction. Furthermore, Ryuga's magical talent was outstanding, so his claim to be a genius magician was not entirely unfounded. His future self admitted that the current Naruto could not win against Ryuga. He suggested they check Haruto's statistics. Naruto opened his stats showing that he was level 15, rank C with the swordsman class. His skills were fencing level 31 and space-time magic level 34. His power was 61, agility 159, defense 9, magic power 0, intelligence B, mental strength by growth potential, as the system showed that his learned spells were level 2 fast body. Level 2 Material Retraction Chain. His future self told him he had grown quite a bit. Then he touched the system, causing a change, and told Aruto that compared to Ryuga's statistics it was nothing. Aruto was surprised and asked his future self if he could see Ryuga's stats. The system showed that Ryuga was level 78, rank A with the mage class. His abilities included level 76 fire magic, level 52 water magic, level 56 wind magic, and level 41 earth magic. His power was 230, agility 475, defense 789, magic power 642, intelligence a mental strength by growth potential B. His future self told him there was a 10 times difference in strength. Aruto still processing this information. He asked his future self if he could see the statistics of others, and if this really was space-time magic. While wondering if there really was such a big difference between them. Then she heard a girl crying nearby, saying she just couldn't do it, crying. He asked why he suddenly became unable to use magic at all, and expressed his fear of failing the regular wizard course exam at this rate. Her friend told her there was nothing wrong with how she used her wand, her singing, or any part of the process. The girl then asked if she had no choice but to accept a private Ryuga lesson at her home. Naruto was stunned and silently listening to the girl reluctantly accept, hoping that everything would end soon after taking off his clothes and closing his eyes. This reminded him of, "If not, I wasn't scared." He clenched his fist in anger and approached the girls. Asking if he could have a moment, the two girls were surprised and asked who he was, and if he was someone from the swordsman course. He told them they didn't have to take those private lessons because he'd take care of everything somehow. Then he raised his palm a little closer to the girl and began to concentrate. He realized that in the magical ability measurement class he could now understand the movements and inner workings of magic. He saw that the magical circuits inside the girl's body were experiencing a burning effect, and the traffic through the circuits was obstructed due to her chanting spells that gave up her ability, realizing that in such cases it is only necessary to eliminate the disturbances in those sections and restore the flow of magic to normal. He opened his eyes and told the girl not to be alarmed. He approached the confused girl, released his power and hit every circuit in her body, causing her to feel momentarily confused while her friend shouted her name and worried. Yuyuko's friend, angry, asked her what she was doing, but he just told Yuyuko to try using some magic now. Yuyuko stammered, and replied that she was fine while her friend asked her if she was okay. Yuyuko released some of her magic and was surprised to feel and see that she could use it again. She shouted happily that she could use magic again, and her friend couldn't believe it, noticing that the magic effect was even stronger than before. As I watched her happily play with her magic, Yuyuko thanked him profusely, but he simply responded not to mention Yuyuko. With tears of happiness she told her friend that she would not have to go through that horrible experience with Ryuga, to which her friend expressed immense relief and happiness. Then he remembered Shinonome's scared face. When he was talking to Ryuga after school, his future self was looking at him, so he asked him what he had to do to become stronger, because there were only 3 days left until the duel and he wanted to close the gap of strength by then. He then asked his future self to tell him which dungeon would have the greatest effect on his growth, and which he could address at that time. His future self smiled and said that he had already prepared the map and information for the next dungeon. Aruto asked what the clearing rewards were, and his future self responded that the rewards were a huge amount of experience points, new magic spells, time-space, the opportunity to test his newly synthesized weapon, and a beast to summon left Brute satisfied, because that was exactly what he was talking about. Then he entered the Zabubi ranked dungeon, a glass labyrinth recommended for adventurers level 65 and above. Although he was satisfied with the challenge, he wondered if he really had to deal with so many enemies while the swarms surrounded him. His future self asked him what he thought about it, and if it was worth the trouble. Showing his chaos sword, he said yes and thanked his future self. He then told her that he won't let even Odyuan escape solo, what he agreed to by jumping into the fray while shouting that he would defeat all the monsters that roamed that dungeon. 1 hour later, in the deepest section of the glass maze, a man slashed an armored monster, but his sword shattered. A woman then activated her staff telling the man to get out of the way. And she attacked the armored monster with her flame jet magic. Proud, she asked the monster if she had liked it, but when the smoke from the fire cleared, they were both shocked to see the dark glass knight still alive with 23 health steal, 50 mana, 340 attack, 610 defense and magic resistance. B hugged each other in horror, realizing that their attacks didn't work when the knight was about to end their lives. They closed their eyes, but then something blocked the knight's attack, causing an explosion. When the man opened his eyes, he was surprised to see someone's sword going through the knight's head, and cutting it open, exploding it into pieces. The woman stammered that they were saved, and the man thanked her. Naruto told them that enemies appeared in large numbers in that dungeon, so it was better for them to leave quickly. The man then asked, worried what he would do. Naruto replied that in order for them to escape successfully, he will attract the enemy's attention. When the knights gathered in front of him, he told them to leave quickly. The man apologized for leaving and thanked him once again. After they left his from the future, he told him that counting the ones from a moment ago, he had defeated 89 of them so far. But that he had not yet fulfilled even half of his quota. Naruto replied that he was fully aware of it. His future self then told him to finish quickly and level up as soon as possible. Then he raised his sword and slashed every monster near him. As he fled from the future, he told her that this type of monster gave the most experience points inside the glass maze. Killing knights was the most efficient way to level up. At their current strength, however, they were formidable enemies. Naruto immediately looked back and used his arrest chain ability to attack every knight who tried to ambush him from behind. His future self reminded him that his weapon, the Sword of Chaos, had been imbued with the element of light, allowing him to fight these monsters on equal terms. Landing in the middle of the group where other knights surrounded him, his future self urged him to defeat as many as possible. Haruto activated his fast body abilities, disagreed with his future self and shouted that he wouldn't even leave one. Just standing. The knights recoiled slightly from his power as he blocked every attack they threw at him. Seeing an opportunity, he cut off every knight in front of him. Then he paused for a moment to catch his breath. But he was surprised when a huge knight charged toward him. He was the Dark Crystal General with 48 steel health, 125 mana, 560 attack, 880 defense and magic resistance. His future self explained that those were the stats of a boss-type monster. Naruto blocked the general's sword with his own. He tried not to be overwhelmed by its sheer strength. Deciding to use his sword's special properties before being overpowered, the sword disappeared and he managed to jump in time to dodge the general's attack. The sword then reappeared, allowing him to get behind the general with incredible speed. He swung it forward and cut off the general's head with all his strength, managing to kill him. Exhausted from his future, he called him and he screamed in frustration, asking what he wanted. Since he was busy dodging attacks from the remaining knights, his future self responded that he probably already knew this, but he would say it. Anyway, the fundamental principles of space-time magic are different from regular magic. It doesn't work through magical ability, but uses a certain factor that governs the flow of time in the world. That's why even someone with zero magical ability like him can activate it. Naruto shouted to his future self. Asked if he was really telling him this now, while he was busy blocking and attacking the knights, his future self calmly replied yes, explaining that extreme conditions during a fight are the most effective way to learn. When he was overwhelmed by the enemy, he activated his chain of detention, striking every knight in front of him. Then he cut them off quickly. Then he heard someone approaching from behind and his from the future. He warned him that he will not come down. The guard gave dark glass sorcerers every 112 steel health, 490 mana, 210 attack, 320 defense and magic resistance. The sorcerers gathered their magic power in their hands. When his future self saw him in astonishment, he reminded him that he was a space-time wizard. He easily dodged his attack as his future one told him that he should always be aware of the Chronos factor. Even during the battle, as the attacks closed in on him, his future self yelled at him to harness the flow of time. He did it by causing the attacks to slow down. Despite this, an attack hit him, and caused an explosion. When the smoke cleared, he emerged and pointed a magic circle at the sorcerers. Raising his other hand, he gathered power, and then attacked the sorcerers with a strong burst of magic, eliminating them instantly. Then he looked at his hand asking his future self if this was what using the flow of time meant. His future self replied yes. That's how it works, and thought that Naruto could be even more talented than him because he had released a Chronos lightning a moment later after killing a bunch of knights and regaining his breath. The system appeared continuously showing him that he had leveled up. Ignoring the notifications, he asked his future self what his next target was. Then he entered the inner chamber of the glass labyrinth on the deepest level and gave the dungeon boss, the sacred servants waiting for him inside. Before entering the chief's door, he felt a sharp pain inside his head. His future self explained that it was a negative side effect of using space-time magic continuously, increasing the load on the brain. His future self then asked him if he wanted to return, but Naruto placed his hands on the door and replied no, saying that time was running out. Then he faced the sacred servants. His future self told him that the chief had a sense of integrity and dignity not found in other monsters and that having said that, he should not let his guard down. The sacred Cerberus growled loudly and approached, while his future self commented that if you said it in an old-fashioned way you could say it was a magical beast. With the soul of a samurai, Naruto clenched his teeth as the pain in his head intensified, which his future felt. While the sacred Cerberus stared at him. His from the future handed him a bottle telling him to drink it because it would make him feel a little better. Naruto agreed and took the bottle. The servers then sat down making him wonder if he was waiting for him to recover, thinking he was a strange dungeon boss. He drank the potion while the server waited and his future self pointed to an old wound on his right flank, advising him to aim for it. As the server's aura of intimidation returned, Naruto wondered if he was really waiting for him and if he owed a debt of gratitude to a samurai. The beast then continued to approach, and tried to attack with its sharp claws. Fortunately, Naruto jumped in time to dodge him and drew his sword, searched his body and saw the wound that his future self mentioned on his chest, but suddenly the Cerberus appeared in front of him at an incredible speed, leaving him shocked. He managed to block with his sword and the Cerberus bit the sword. Naruto fought to hold it while the Cerberus tried to destroy it with his sharp teeth. Then he dropped his sword and leaped over the Cerberus, but one of his other heads gathered power in his mouth. His from the future he shouted that it was a weapon of breath, and that he must dodge it. Naruto spun in the air as he gathered power and when the Cerberus exhaled, he managed to dodge it. Gathering power in his fist, he saw that the wound area was open. Taking the opportunity, he hit her, causing the beast to scream in pain. Then he jumped away to create distance and his future self vaguely asked him to wait a moment. The server was shaking his three heads and his future self asked him if he had healed his old wound with pressure point treatment. Naruto responded that he had paid Cerberus to wait for him and wanted to fight fair, and at the same time his future self shouted that he was crazy and warned that he could die. But Naruto in his mind, insisted that respect should be returned even to a monster. Also, he added, if he died there, that would be all the server would achieve. He threw something at him and his future self was surprised to see that he had returned his sword. He looked at him seriously, understanding the situation, but Naruto told him he wouldn't need to. The sword clenched his hands into fists and challenged the beast by declaring that this was not a leveling session. but a subjugation of a dungeon master. A fight they had while he fled from the future. He wondered what the hell was going on between them. Suddenly, the surveyors leapt to attack. Naruto blocked, but the surveyors threw his claw and hit him, sending him flying before crashing into the glass behind him. He managed to pull himself together and leapt back to attack. He hit one of his heads, managing to unbalance him. But then another head bit his arm. The beast dragged him and crashed him against the glass. Haruto screamed in pain and his future shouted his name, asking him to recover the surveyors. Then he gathered power in his three heads. Simultaneously, Haruto used the flow of time, which helped him slow down the attack. He swore that he would put everything he had into it when his ability faded. The ES server had gathered his breath weapon and released it in his direction. Naruto was still sitting when the Cerberus approached with a nimble movement, managed to dodge him, and appeared under the beast. He punched with all his might, but the intense pain in his arm made him stop. The Cerberus's bite had left its mark. The beast counterattacked with its sharp claws, but Haruto channeled its energy into a precise punch to the neck. The Cerberus roared in pain, leapt toward him, and threw a powerful kick, declaring that it was all over. It struck the central head, shaking the ground before the Cerberus fell in defeat. Naruto, losing his balance, wondered if he had always been this impulsive. Before he collapsed. The system announced that he had completed Asabubi's classified dungeon moments later. He woke up to someone asking him if he was finally awake, looked to the side and saw his future self watching him. Cautiously she sat up and commented that she had somehow managed to beat him. The system showed that his level had risen by 20 points, surprised by the increase. Furthermore, he noticed that he had obtained the wizard's robe from space-time, wondering what was his from the future, explained that it was formal clothing and suggested trying it on later. Suddenly something blocked the light in front of him, and he was surprised to see the sacred deer standing nearby. He stood quickly as the deer approached, but then wagged his tails like a puppy, confusing him even more, extended his hand and managed to touch him, caressing him. As his future self told him that he seemed to like him very much, Naruto asked if he was really the dungeon boss. His future self admitted that he never expected things to be this way. But they still got the rewards. Haruto mentioned the equipment, but his future self shook his head, explaining that the true reward was the sacred Cerberus, the best prize in the glass dungeon. However, they had not yet formalized an official contract, and if Haruto gave him his blood, he would become his vassal. Haruto bit his finger and put his blood into the Cerberus's mouth. The deer slowly disappeared, while his future self told him that from now on he could summon it whenever he wanted. The system confirmed that the sacred deer was now his vassal. Your future self. He assured him that with this he had achieved what they came to do. 3 days later, in the secondary division of the Adventurer Cultivation Agency, the students were muttering about Naruto as he passed with scratches, a torn uniform and a bandage on his face. But he didn't see me from behind and cautiously asked him where he had been and what he had been doing, since he had not been able to communicate with him at all. He simply replied that he had been training, especially in preparation for the duel. She asked him what that special training consisted of, and wondered what he could have been doing to be so exhausted. He assured her confidently that one way or another he was ready, making her question whether he was really the same Naruto she knew. They talked without realizing that Ryuga was watching them from a tree. Ryuga thought that Naruto had fled a long time ago and smiled in disbelief when he saw that he had chosen to come there and publicly show how pathetic a moment it was. Then they met in the hallway and Ryuga told him that his duel would take place that day. After classes, Ryuga jokingly asked him if he was ready and called him Lord Mystic, Dragon Hunter. Naruto simply replied in the affirmative, and Ryuga reminded him that he had not forgotten the absurd condition that the loser proposed would drop out of school. Naruto confirmed that he remembered that the loser had to leave school. Ryuga agreed, but said that was boring, suggesting adding 100,000 credits to the gambler, approximately $640,000. The men behind Ryuga asked mockingly if he was going to back off now and told him not to ruin everyone's fun, so he should take the bet. Aruto's future self that was in his bag realized that Ryuga was using the students to provoke Aruto and cut off his retreat. Thinking that Ryuga was as cunning as ever, Naruto felt that Shinonome squeezed his hand tightly, and saw his fear as he looked at Ryuga, who was smiling. Thinking that he would take everything Haruto owned and make him his slave, Shinonome tried to stop him with hesitation, but Haruto simply told him that he understood and that he was fine with the 100,000 credits bet. Ryuga turned around smiling and told him that he was looking forward to his magical duel after school. Before leaving, she told Shinonome that she had chosen to cover for the wrong person, so she should be ready for the personal lesson he would give her. She clenched her fist in fear, but Aruto told her not to worry. When she looked at him, he confidently assured her that he would definitely win after school. Aruto was walking down the hallway when his from the future reminded him that it was time for the duel. He replied that he knew, but stopped when he saw a group of students gathered in front of him. They told him it was a coincidence and suggested playing with him a little before his duel with Ryuga. Another group of students appeared behind him, mentioning a bonus of 1,000 credits for every one if they beat it, calling it a big juicy reward. Aruto. I kept quiet by making the students ask him what was wrong and if he was afraid. They made fun of him, saying that even crying and begging would not convince them to let him go, but he muttered that that was a relief, baffling them. Then he told them he was relieved to know that Ryuga was still using the same old tactics he expected. He commented that Ryuga was so trash it was almost refreshingly cliché, but now he could crush it without worries and they would be the first to get what they deserved. The leader of the group in front of him called him a bastard and shouted at him not to get so arrogant. While attacking him, Naruto simply grabbed the man's face and threw him to the ground, breaking him. Then he looked at the other students and told them that it was a nuisance and that they should all come at once. Later, in the Adventurer Cultivation Agency arena, Ryuga asked, arrogant, what did they mean, calling Aruto Dragon Hunter, when all he did was brag arrogantly, and now he didn't show up, wasting his time. He asked the referee if he agreed that if Aruto didn't arrive in the next minute he should take the victory by default. The referee replied in the affirmative. The other students surrounded Ryuga, saying that Haruto was too stupid to try to confront him and that he had probably gone home. Scared, Ryuga smiled, thinking that his minions had probably already torn Haruto to pieces. On the other hand, if not, I wasn't in the audience praying for Haruto. Suddenly, a student shouted that Haruto was there. Ryuga turned in shock and disbelief as he walked towards the stage. Ryuga asked what he was doing there, but Naruto simply responded by asking what was strange about him when they were supposedly going to have a duel. Ryuga couldn't believe it and thought about his minions without knowing that they had all collapsed in the hallway. Then Naruto confronted Ryuga and told him that they should start. He called the referee and told him to give the signal to begin, which the referee reluctantly agreed. He presented his Mirage Ryuga, a third-year student from Class 3A, against Aruto, a second-year student from Class 2F. The referee shouted to start the duel, causing Ryuga to panic. He didn't know how Aruto had managed it, but he decided he would put an end to it himself right then and there. Ryuga shouted that he would go with everything from the beginning and activated his magic flame power, enveloping the stage in fire. Let's put a fresh, natural new twist on this epic ending. Ryuga mockingly approached Aruto and asked him if he was ready for what was coming. Aruto's future self warned him that Ryuga would start with the fire spell, Hellfire Tunic, a high-level spell. Ryuga concentrated fire in his palm and threw it at Aruto, shouting for him to die. Knowing that Ryuga was not restraining himself at all while active, his material recoil ability noticed that the fire bullets caused a disturbance in the flow of time. As they advanced, he could see the past positions of the fireballs in that disturbance, as well as future traces, showing where they would be watching closely. He managed to dodge them as they approached. When the bullets of fire were about to reach him, he dodged them easily. Ryuga was in a state of soki and disbelief, shouting that it was impossible. When Haruto stepped on the ground, it released a flame that surprised him, but he jumped in time to dodge the wave of fire. Ryuga cried out in disbelief when he saw that Haruto had dodged even his double strike trap. Then Ryuga was stunned to see Haruto Sobre launching an attack. Haruto attacked Raluga with his chrono beam, hitting him and crashing him to the ground, tearing him to pieces. The audience couldn't believe what they were seeing and asked in panic what technique was that. And if Haruto had magical ability, nil. If not, I simply cheered up and shouted that he was amazing, confirming that he was no longer the same Naruto he knew. Continuing with our story, Naruto goes down on stage and asks Dejugas if he's not going to give it all from the beginning. Dejugas gets up at once. Enraged by the provocation, he lunges at him shouting not to make fun of him. He calmly waits for him as Dejugas approaches, noting that the fire he releases is the spell Fire Dragon's Burning Fist, a melee attack shrouded in 3000 C flames. However, the intense heat only affects what Dejugo touches. Despite this, he blocks Dejugo's fiery fist with his hand, making Dejugo Sunday thinking he's an idiot for not realizing his spell ignites anything he touches including him, but then kicks one of Dejugo's feet off balance and knocks him down onto the stage while still holding his fist. He then points the fiery fist at Dejugo, causing him to panic and sweat with fear. He throws his fist, but deliberately misses Dejugo's face, hitting the ground instead. Raising his fist, he tells Dejugo that his flames are now out. Dejugo gets up and jumps back screaming that he's a miserable piece of trash that's going to fail. Anyway, looking at his men behind him, Dejugo asks them if they know what to do, to which he responds by releasing his power. Men channel their magic into Dejugo, amplifying their own power. His future self thinks it's a flagrant violation of the rules, but refreshingly bold. He then asks Dejugo how much energy he needs from others, but Dejugo, slowly transforming, just laughs mockingly. Dejugo's feet transform into flaming monster paws as he unleashes his ultimate secret technique. A chain of bright light and fire surrounds Dejugo, and a strong magical power of flames extends across the stage. He is stunned to witness Dejugo's transformation into a demonic incarnation of flame. His future tells him that Dejugo is now a giant imbued with the magical power of several dozen wizard course students and that he will not be able to handle him with ordinary methods. He replies that he knows. Dejugo attacks with a blast of fire breath. But he jumps just in time to avoid it. He counterattacks with his chrono beam, but is surprised to see that it has no yoke effect. He then releases fire claws and tries to catch him, but narrowly dodges the flaming claws. In his desperate attempt to evade, he crashes into the wall, realizing he has nowhere to run. Panic seizes him as the flames surround him and Dejugo moves closer. He activates his time flow ability and notices something strange within the flow, like a rip. In time itself he sees a gap within the demonic form of the Dejugo. He thinks if he can tear it apart anymore, he might destroy it. However, before he can act, Dejugo launches his huge palm to crush him. When Dejugo thinks he has won, he cuts off the demon's hand, causing it to disintegrate into pieces. He then jumps up and yells at his future self to let him use the stuffed animal again his future. Though furious, he transforms into the teddy bear saying there is no other way. He grabs the plush and throws it using his stop chain ability, activating his quick body ability. He leaps towards the stuffed animal in the middle of the chains, using the force to leap high to the top of the yoke. Once at the top, he uses his time flow ability again. Seeing the rip in the flow of time, he raises his sword and cuts the hole in the demon's body, scraping it in half and revealing Arajugu inside. Controlling it, Rejuice panics and screams in surprise, demanding to know what is happening. She looks at him exclaiming that it is absolutely impossible, because as long as the singing continues, the magic will regenerate the giant indefinitely. Rejugu hides behind him and asks why he is not regenerating and grabs him by the neck, screaming that there is no such principle in magic that he knows of. In response, he punches Yugo in the stomach, causing him to pass out on the ground. Then he looks at the host and asks what follows. The host stuttering announces that the winner is Kajiju Aruto. Later, Rin and his friends gather around a table full of food. Rin then shouts at everyone that they should say it together now. And everyone congratulates him on his great victory in the magical duel. Surprised, he thanks them. Ring shyly raises his glass and tells him to do the honors. She shyly raised her glass and stammered for everyone to toast, to which the girls responded cheerfully with cheers. Then they began to clash their drinks and one of the girls sighed, expressing relief and happiness that Yugo would leave school. Another girl commented that Yugo treated the school as her personal property and that it was too much. The girls also mentioned that Yugo tried to solve everything with money and even committed sexual harassment. One of the girls told Ring that given a little more time Yugo could have caught her, to which she stammered yes. The purple-haired girl. Then she asked him what happened to the 100 million credits that were at stake in the fight. He replied that he had completely forgotten about that bet. To everyone's surprise, they asked him why and told him it was a waste. He replied that he was never after the money, making the girls think Kane was very cool. Then she called him and asked him what his relationship was with Ring. Confusing him and causing Ring to spit out his juice in shock, Ring asked Kana what she was saying all of a sudden. Akana replied that she meant that Aruto confronted the highest-ranked student in the school for her and asked him what the meaning of that was and what their relationship was. He panicked and couldn't answer. Just as I was about to answer. The girls looked at him excitedly, but he just said he needed to go to the bathroom. He got up and left the room, making Akana tell everyone that he had escaped. The purple-haired girl told everyone that she felt that Haruto had changed in some way and asked them if they felt it too. The black-haired girl replied yes, saying that she felt that Haruto was more Maduro-centered, especially recently. Haruto was almost invisible and had a terrible nickname, but now everything had changed. Ring. Then she thought that since that day Naruto had always been there to help and protect her, and she was sure that he would always be like that. He blushed to think that they even shared a secret just between the two of them. Meanwhile, Naruto was in the bathroom washing his hands. When he got a message on his phone. She read Ring's message apologizing that her friends had gone too far with her questions and telling her not to think too much about it. He smiled as he read it and thought he hadn't seen anything this lively in a long time. Then he squeezed his hand. Remembering the days when he thought such happiness would never return, memories of his parents and little sister, eating with him, flooded his mind, making him realize that the future can change. He was suddenly surprised when his future, still inside the stuffed animal, called to him and appeared behind him. She asked him what was going on and told him they were going home in a while, so he should stay still until then. But his future self told him it was an emergency, and that the time had finally come. Which confused him. He asked her what her future self meant. His future self responded that it was time to reveal the reason he was there and that his little sister, who was supposed to be dead, was alive. This confused him even more and explained that Ria died in an accident a long time ago. But his future self insisted that not in the world he is in, and that he should prepare immediately because they would go to save Ria. Then she remembered Ria excitedly telling her to look at her and showing her the red scarf. He told her that it looked very warm and asked her if she had made it herself, to which she answered proudly, yes, that she had made it all by herself. He replied that he understood, which made her laugh. She gave him the scarf, telling him it was for him. He felt confused and wondered if he would look good in it. She asked him sadly if he didn't love her, even though he worked so hard to get her. He quickly reassured her by telling her that it wasn't that and that of course he loved her. Her face lit up with a smile and, excited, She put the scarf around his neck, telling him that he should have kept quiet and taken it. While looking at the scarf, Leah mentioned that the seam was a little loose. When he finished putting it on, he told her that tomorrow was Christmas and that it was a present from Diane the Claus. He replied that he understood and thanked her. Then she sat next to him, saying that they should have a Christmas party one day late. When he got home from his recital of Valetti, which was a promise, she also told him that she would give him another present. So unfortunately he couldn't keep that promise the next morning. The plane Ria and her parents were on crashed and they never made it home. He came back to reality when he heard his future self calling his name, asking if he was listening. He stood for a moment looking at the cabinet in front of him, where the photo of his family was next to the red scarf that Ria had given him. Then he apologized to his future self for being distracted and asked him to repeat what he had said. His future self told him he had to concentrate because he was about to face a mission he couldn't fail. Did he answer that he did ask his future self why would he want to? Her little sister was alive in the first place, when all the passengers died in that plane crash. There was no way she could be alive. His future self asked him what he had heard about the confused accident. He replied that he had only heard that it was due to a mysterious rupture in the air that occurred at high altitude. His future self explained that it must have seemed so to them, as the mystery was beyond his current science. This puzzled him and he asked his future self what he meant his future self. He replied that that day a space-time hole opened in the sky. It was a hole that connected his world to another dimension, even in the future. It is impossible to predict where one will appear. That hole started to distort gravity when it appeared, and unfortunately the plane his family was on flew close to it. The plane became uncontrollable due to the gravitational field caused by the hole and crashed shortly afterwards. He couldn't believe it and told his future self that it still didn't change the fact that all the passengers died in the accident. His future responded that, although no one survived the accident, his sister's body was never found. In other words, his sister was sucked into the time-space hole alone, which left him stunned. Yours. Future. Then he explained that the place to which the hole leads is called the dimensional void. Neither the flow of time nor the very definition of space there are the same as in her world, even if many years have passed in her world for Ria. It would be less than a blink when the time-space hole opens again. Your sister will return to your world. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, but his future explained that this was the reason he had come to train and guide him. He told him that in the future, by the time he discovered the point where the other dimension crossed, it was already too late. So he must be the one in this world who saves Ria. Your future self. Then she begged him to save Ria. To his surprise, he stood up and replied that he understood and asked where the hole would appear. His future temporal space replied that he would appear far above the Tokyo Tower, on the top floor of the Sky Castle dungeon. The next day I was on a rooftop near Tokyo Tower. His future self commented that he never thought he would buy all the offensive items and recovery potions they had in the adventurer shop. He replied that it was all thanks to the ridiculous amount of money he made leveling up in the Crystal Maze of Doom. His future self noticed that he was wearing a scarf in mid-June, to which he responded that he was sensitive to cold, and his future self decided not to insist on the matter. His future. Then he explained that the door to the Sky Castle dungeon is on the observation deck of Tokyo Tower. In 24 hours, the temporal space hole would open in the air 300 meters above the top floor of the Sky Castle dungeon and expel his sister, but if he didn't arrive in time, his sister would fall to her death. Naruto replied that he knew as he clenched his fist and pulled the time-space-age robe out of his inventory. Then he put it on and swore to his future self that he would definitely save Ria. He went to Tokyo Tower, where the guards shouted at him to stop, telling him that a dungeon door had appeared on the observation deck, and that only adventurers with a higher rank license could enter. Ignoring them, he walked away, which caused his future self to ask him what he planned to do. Now he replied that there was no time, so they should take the shortcut. Activating his quick body ability, he leapt over the metal tower, climbing higher and higher. Clinging to his tower, Future commented that he was beginning to learn his methods, to which he responded that it was annoying. He jumped to the side of the observation deck and peered inside, spotting soldiers with an adventurer named Kurigan. His future self warned him that Kurigan was a troublesome fellow. He asked his future self if he knew this man and his future self. He replied that Kurigane should be the head of the Monato branch of the Adventurers Guild. Back then, Kurigane was known for being stubborn, overly serious, and overly honest. His future self also explained that Kurigans would just check the area around the gate and wait to see if anything happened, but they couldn't wait for that. And that they should hurry through the door. He drew his sword, causing a sound that surprised Kurigane and the soldiers. Kurigan ordered a soldier to check for noise, and when the soldier inspected the area, everything seemed to be in order, without any broken windows. He suddenly appeared behind the soldier and hit the back of his neck with his palm, causing the soldier to instantly collapse using material ruin. He restored the window he'd broken to get into the observation deck, making sure the soldier didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Moments later, the soldier ran back to inform Kurigane that they had a problem. Kurigane asked what it was and the soldier explained that he found an intruder who was too strong to handle. Surprising Kurigane, Kurigane declared that he would personally confront him and told his soldiers to accompany him. When Kurigan and the soldiers moved, the soldier who had reported stayed behind. Once they were gone, the soldier took off his helmet, revealing that he was.
Haruto really missed you dearly.
Future congratulated him on the successful strategy. Naruto then walked towards the entrance of the dungeon, telling his future self that they should
leave, as his future self prompted.
Agreement, and both entered the dungeon. Once inside, he was surprised to see that the world was upside down. He realized that going down the stairs in Sky Castle's dungeon meant they were actually going up, and he understood why it was still called a dungeon despite being in the sky.
Yours.
Future explained that the theme of the dungeon was the occult and warned him that undead and ghostly monsters would attack him. He commented that it was ironic to face an army of the dead in the middle of a clear blue sky and that the setting did not suit his fighting style as a swordsman.
His self.
Future reminded him that this had been taken into account, asking if he remembered the element that had been imbued into his sword. During the synthesis, he was surprised when he remembered that it was the attribute of light.
His self.
Future asked him if he hadn't mentioned it before and explained that this was the main reason he had been training him. His future self urged him to move on. He hurried to the door, but stopped in surprise when someone appeared in front of them. He swung his sword, slashing at the stranger, and continued toward the door.
His self.
Future informed him that in the future the dungeon had come from had disappeared shortly after being discovered, so no one had set foot in it. However, I had some information while Naruto was busy killing monsters on the way.
Your future self.
He explained that the Castle of Heaven consisted of a total of 100 floors, with a powerful and inescapable boss, guarding every 20 floors. Naruto realized that meant there were 5 bosses. Checking his phone to check the time, he saw that he only had 20 hours left, which meant he couldn't waste time with lesser enemies. Suddenly he stopped, surprised to see the monsters emerging from the ground, a horde of thousands of monsters running to attack him. Frustrated and angry, he prepared for battle as the monsters surrounded him. Leaving him with nowhere to flee, he called Cerbero the sacred beast. Cerberus appeared, killing nearby monsters. He told Cerbero that there was no time to lose and that they needed to get through the monsters as quickly as possible. On the 5th floor of Sky Castle's dungeon, the monsters charged at them, but they rode Cerbero, evading and killing the monsters. On the way, he noticed the speed of his progress and his future self. He explained that, as his full name suggests, Cerberus is a sacred beast, meaning that his attacks are inherently imbued with the sacred attribute. He told Cerbero to keep moving at great speed. They reached the 6th floor, then the 7th, 8th, 9th and so on until they reached the 20th floor, where the first chief resided. Cervero stopped running. Surprised, she asked him what was going on. But then he heard a noise above them. Looking up, he saw a smoke portal appear. He jumped from Cerberus as his future informed him that this was the first of the bosses to appear every 20 floors and that he must be victorious to unlock the stairs. On the next level, horses emerged from the portal, followed by a carriage they were dragging. He saw someone controlling the horses and the carriage as he descended from the sky. It landed on the ground and 3 people with dark auras got out of the carriage. He recognized them as the son of the family in noble fall. The lady and the master bowed gracefully towards him as he noticed that they were undead rank monsters. He decided not to worry, knowing that if he couldn't defeat them, he wouldn't be able to save his sister.
Yours.
Future shouted that they were coming and saw the 3 nobles running towards him to attack. He told his future self to retire, which caused his future self to ask him if he was going to use the item he bought in the guild store. He replied that if his future self immediately jumped off his shoulder, it activated his Eye of Time, allowing him to see the flow of time and predict what was going to happen. He pulled out Orichalco's knives and tossed them to the noble son. The noble son didn't even flinch and attacked with his sword, but ducked just in time to avoid it. Then he ran toward the noble lady, attacking her with the knives he controlled. She tried to grab him, but he managed to cut her. He immediately looked back and threw one of the knives at the noble monster coming behind him. He managed to drive the knives into the noble master's chest, while the noble master charged at him. He covered himself and was hit by it, but managed to put his hand on the ground and stop so as not to be pushed further. He was glad that he had prepared everything perfectly and that he could distance himself from them without any problems. Then he raised his hand in front of the 3 nobles and squeezed it to detonate the knives embedded in the fallen nobles. They released a bright light and exploded, taking the fallen nobles with them.
Your future self.
She reminded him that each Orichalco leaf, made of the rarest and hardest metals in any dungeon, was an ultra-luxury object worth 100,000 credits each, and became explosive when an electric current passed. Through them he commented that he was throwing them without thinking twice.
Your future.
He then asked her if it was cheap to win, throwing a few million credits into the problem, but she replied that it wasn't over yet because it had only destroyed their physical bodies. Now they had returned like ghosts to attack him. As he suspected, damaging ghost-type monsters with physical attacks was complicated, but he also knew that it exposed their vulnerabilities. He drew his sword imbued with the attribute of light, jumped and hurled his sword at the fallen noble ghosts using his Chaos Meteor ability. He cut them repeatedly with incredible speed, causing them to disintegrate into ashes. The system notified him that the fallen noble family had been defeated. His level increased by 5, his swordsman skill by 8 and he obtained 22,883,217 credits. The stairs to the next floor opened and he approached telling Rhea to wait because her older brother was coming to rescue her. Hours later, on the 40th floor of the dungeon of the Castle of Heaven, where the second chief resided, Cervero opened his huge mouth and bit the neck of the queen, not dead, killing her. After defeating Lamia, Cerberus approached him when he stroked him. Cerberus wagged his tails like a happy dog. He praised him for his good work and his future. He commented that Cerberus was more of a pet than a sacred beast. With mine defeated, there were only 3 more bosses left later on the 50th floor.
Your future self.
He shouted for him to stop, and Cervero stopped. I asked his future self what was going on and why they had to stop there.
Yours.
Future told him that there was no mistake and that he should activate the Eye of Time and look at the wall. Following the instructions, he was surprised to see a hidden room behind his wall. Future jumped off his shoulder explaining that in his own timeline the dungeon had disappeared before anyone set foot in it, but this time it seemed like it would be conquered at last.
Your future self.
Then it turned into an envelope and told him to insert it into a crack in the wall, just like before. He placed the envelope in the crack in the wall, just as his future self had ordered. The wall split in two as he ordered Cervero to wait outside, and Cervero sat down in response. Inside they saw a huge glass in the center of the hidden room. He asked his future self if it wasn't another trick like before, but his future self assured him that he wouldn't do that now. The system showed that the crystal in front of him was called an Akashic crystal, which could unlock hidden or untapped abilities of the person who came into contact with it. He touched the Akashic glass and it shattered. Then he saw that he had gained magic, time-space, got gravity bomb and avatar reproduction, and his fast body level increased to 3 and arrest chain level to 2. In addition, it had obtained release of potential level 3.1 increased by 75%.
His self.
Future told him that he now had avatar reproduction and asked him what he was doing, but his future self suggested trying it out in real combat. He replied that he thought he would say that. Hours later they arrived on the 60th floor to confront the third boss. Son Viviel Sebab, known as Lord of the Flies, asked what his weak point was and,
Your future self.
He explained that it was a flying monster that spits a corrosive solution, has regeneration abilities, and stinks. He asked his future self if he was just listing his characteristics, but then he was surprised. When Beale leaves, she appears in front of him launching an attack. Realizing his speed, he felt the sting of his strong nose and thought it had killed him, but then it disappeared, which surprised him. Beale leaves, he admired backward when his future asked him if he managed to use it in real combat. Then he launched himself at Beale, going from behind. He used his avatar playback temporal space magic and threw the stuffed animal while activating level 3 fast body. Just as Beelzeva was about to go through him again, he quickly ran to dodge him, analyzing his speed on his feet, and ran around Beelzeva at high speed, making sure to keep his movements unpredictable and elusive.
His self.
Future explained that magic, Avatar's temporal reproduction space, creates a clone of his past to temporarily take his place, confusing the enemy by making him believe he was multiplying. He drew his sword and advanced toward Beelzebub thanks to Avatar's reproduction. A swarm of him seemed to launch an attack. He activated his Chaos Meteor Sword ability and approached, but Beelzebub spat poison. The poison seemed to hit him, but Beelzebub was surprised when the poison pierced him and cut Beelzebub into pieces, killing him with multiple attacks to prevent his regeneration. Beelzebub was successfully eliminated and slowly disappeared. His future self joked that he could now call himself a ninja master. He responded by telling his future self that he would stop because it would be out of character. When the stairs to the next floor opened, he told his future self that there were only 2 bosses left. He approached the stairs to continue, but suddenly felt an intense pain in his head, knelt on the ground and collapsed, causing his future self to call out his name and panic. 3 years ago he was absorbed in his thoughts while Real pleaded with him and acted. Adorably, despite his pleas, he remained silent, still pondering. She assured him that she would do her best and not give up halfway, begging him to accept. He sighed in defeat and asked her if she really wanted to take ballet classes, to which she responded excitedly, yes. He agreed and told her to choose the ballet shoes she liked best and will show them to her later, which made her very happy. Then she started humming while looking at a brochure of ballet shoes, and he smiled at his happy little sister. The next day, at ballet school, the students were stretching and chatting. When Ria appeared, she thanked them for waiting, and told them she was ready. The girls told Ria that they were glad they could do it together and that they should all do their best. Ria looked back and saluted happily, and he returned the salute. One of Ria's friends later bothered her by saying that she had a brother complex and that they could smell spring in the air. They asked her if it wasn't nice to have her brother as a companion, to which Ria, despite her initial surprise, laughed and said it was indeed nice and comforting to have her brother by her side. Then they started their ballet lesson. As he watched from behind, Ria followed the person in front of her, extending her arms, lifting one of her feet, standing on her toes, and spinning. He smiled happily because she seemed to be having a lot of fun. After ballet lesson, Rhea said goodbye to her friends and they walked home together. Rhea told him that ballet was very fun and difficult, but that she was determined to do her best. He replied that he understood, and that was good. Ria then looked at him and stopped, calling him by name. He looked at her confused as she asked if the shoes and lessons were expensive. He replied that they were not expensive at all and that he should not worry. She mentioned that since her parents had gone abroad to give a presentation at an academic conference, she knew it must have been with her own money. This surprised him, and he felt a sense of appreciation for her understanding. Realizing that she had found out, he told her that he was really fine and that he shouldn't worry. He asked her if she had had fun before, and when she said she was glad she had found something she liked to do because that was what he had always wanted for her. Moved, she held up his lunchbox and thanked him warmly for what made him happier. Then she grabbed his arm and told him she loved him. He told her pulling did it. It was dangerous, but she replied that it wasn't and that they always would be. She also told him that she had decided to put all her effort into cooking a meal to show him how much she loved him. He awoke and found himself lying on Cerberus. His future self, worried, told him that he had finally woken up. He asked if he had fainted and his future self answered yes, explaining that he had used too much energy. He mentioned that the highest grade potion he had bought at the guild store was used. That would be fine, but his future self said he'd already taken care of that. Although his physical wounds were healed, the potion would not reverse his panicked mental fatigue. He asked about the time limit. His future self informed him that there were only 5 hours left. He stood up determined and said that they should move on. Promising Ria that they would attend his ballet lessons together. Again his future self stared at him as he walked towards the stairs to the next floor. His future self knew that only one of the 5 intermediate bosses remained, and after defeating him, the final boss of the dungeon would be next. However, at this rate Aruto probably couldn't last much longer. He realized he had no choice but to use his last resort. A moment later, they reached the 80th floor and faced the 4th boss, King Mummy. Acid using his time-space magic, Gravity Beam easily defeated the Acid Mummy King, causing him to crash to the ground. As a result, he gained 2 level increases, his Chinese sword skill increased by 4, and obtained 3561110 credits. Exhausted. He caught his breath and Cervero appeared behind him to encourage him, which led him to thank the system. He asked her if she wanted to use an elixir, to which she said yes. His health was restored, but he still felt pain in his head due to his future fatigue. She asked him if he wanted to rest, but he said no. Knowing that there was not much time left, only 3 hours before her sister came out of the hole, temporal space approached the stairs to the next floor. Telling them to head upstairs, they finally reached the 100th floor of the Sky Castle dungeon. He told his future self that they had finally reached space and his future self informed him that it was time to confront the dungeon boss. His future self explained that after defeating the boss he would reach the precise place where the hole would appear. Time-Space clenched his fist and told his future self to move on. He entered the room of the last chief and saw the god of the underworld, the Reaper of Souls, sitting in his chair. The Soul Reaper stared at them with his red eyes and his future noticed that the monster in front of them did not exist in the database of the world he came from. The Soul Reaper stood up and commented that he was human and only one surprised him. Realizing that it was a highly intelligent life form capable of understanding language, the Soul Reaper praised it, saying that for someone of the lowly human race, whose members can do no better than group together and attack en masse, to have come this far by himself was commendable. If only for that. The Halmas Reaper then grabbed his scythe and drew his sword. They also faced each other. The Soul Reaper introduced himself as the god of the underworld and told him that they should start by promising to grant him the most painful death. His future leapt from his shoulder and informed him that the Soul Reaper's weapon was actually in the database. It was called the Curse Command Divine Scythe, a casting staff for high-level illusion magic, imbued with permanent psychic diva effects. It was an extremely dangerous weapon, but he replied that he didn't care and that he would defeat it immediately. Activating his time stream, he saw the Soul Reaper's weakness. He then activated level 3 fast body, and jumped towards the Soul Reaper to attack, surprising him with his speed. The Soul Reaper raised his scythe and swung it at him, but he dodged and leaped into the air to avoid the attack. As the scythe swung again, he pulled out a knife and aimed at the Soul Dryer's weakness, throwing it, but the Soul Dryer blocked it with the scythe. Then she leapt and appeared in front of him at incredible speed, swinging her scythe. He hit it, but it was only a copy, which the Soul Reaper realized. Too late, she appeared behind him and used her ability. Chain of Detention. The chains grabbed the Soul Reaper, and as he approached to attack the trapped enemy, the Soul Reaper warned that such a curse would not work on a god. He watched in amazement how easily the chains dissolved. Free. The Soul Reaper swung his scythe toward him with incredible speed, the blade nearing his neck. His future self called his name in panic and concern. Fortunately, he ducked his head and body just in time to dodge her, placed his hand on the ground to regain his balance, and jumped to create distance between them. The Soul Reaper commented that he seemed confident in his speed, having dodged the divine scythe twice. However, she taunted him by saying that he was still an inferior life form, without wings. Forced to crawl across the ground, the Soul Reaper told him that he would hamper his legs first and then use his cursed dimension, making him feel a strong aura as the ground beneath him turned upside down. Seeing the Soul Reaper, now upside down, he cried out, asking if he was upside down. Again he just smiled mockingly, and then the floor began to collapse. It started to fall. Realizing the gravity of the situation, he had taken a significant effort to reach the 100th floor and was now descending. The Soul Dryer swung its cursed scythe at him, telling him he couldn't move as freely as he did. Panicked, he quickly pulled out a knife and threw it, thinking that sometimes you have to break some eggs to make an omelette. He ordered the knife to explode, and the impact caused the scythe to fail. Although the force of the explosion pushed him against a wall, when he realized there was a wall, he plunged his sword into it and held on tightly to avoid falling further. The Soul Reaper was astonished, but continued to provoke him. He deduced that the whole phenomenon of falling was probably the illusion magic that the Soul Reaper specialized in, and that he could have fallen under his spell when he looked into the Soul Reaper's eyes. Did you wonder how to undo the spell? Once again he looked at the Soul Reaper and was surprised to see him near him, opened his mouth and spat an attack. He jumped in time, but one of his legs was hit and the curse spread quickly. The Soul Reaper told him that he would be the last subject for his magic test, and that the grudge of the dead humans would devour his body. He continued to provoke him. Wondering if the hatred of his own kind or the scythe of the underworld would kill him. He first gave the smoke reaching his body, and knowing that he must escape from dimensional space quickly, he desperately searched for a way to do so. The Soul Reaper raised his scythe and mockingly said goodbye to him, swinging his scythe and clenching his teeth in panic, wondering if that would be his end in a place like that at that moment. He heard Arya calling him and closed his eyes as the scythe of the Soul Reaper descended. Suddenly, someone used level 78 arrest chain to stop the Soul Reaper. Surprisingly, she looked at her future self and called her name in amazement, but her future self told her that this was her last resort. The stuffed animal emitted a bright light as if it was going to explode. He saw it slowly changing, but the bright light was too intense, so he covered his eyes. Then he heard an explosion, and was stunned to see someone appear out of nowhere. His future self in its true form. His future self told him it would be problematic if he died there. Continuing with our story, the battle continued its course with Naruto and his future self, facing off against the fearsome Soul Reaper. The atmosphere was tense, charged with dark magic and a work of power that could suffocate anyone. However, Naruto, with the support of his future version, he was not intimidated. His future self had activated a powerful ability, Rewind Everything and Haruto. he gaped as time flowed backwards. He floated in the air as his sword, which had been embedded in the rock, returned to his hand. The ground, shattered beneath his feet, began to be repaired stone by stone until the landscape was completely restored. The soul dryer stared at him, visibly surprised by the skill he had just witnessed. "Did you just undo a spell cast by a god?" he asked incredulously. But before Aruto could answer, his from the future landed right in front of him, without much ceremony. "It's been a long time since I've seen myself like this," he said calmly. As if all this was a simple walk. The Reaper, furious, roared, demanding to know what he hoped to achieve by adding a simple human to his ranks. "The first act of this battle is over," he declared, and unleashed a wave of dark energy that swirled around him. From that magic sprang dozens of deformed hands and heads, followed by an army of demon angels. "The god of the underworld will give them his divine judgment," he proclaimed, confident of his victory. But Haruto's future self hardly seemed affected. "So you can even spawn high-ranked monsters," he said. Almost disdainfully, he ordered Aruto to his feet, assuring him that he would take care of the lesser enemies. Aruto hesitated for a moment. After all, the Soul Reaper was a divine entity, a monster of rank, a god who surpassed him in power. "With the mastery you now have over the magic of space-time, victory is assured," said his future version with implacable certainty. "We're the same person, remember?" With renewed confidence, Naruto stood up and stood next to his future self. The latter whispered a plan in his ear that surprised him, but Haruto didn't have time to process it completely. The Soul Reaper noticed the exchange and, without wasting any time, raised his hand, ordering his monsters to rip them apart. Without leaving a trace, the enemy attacked. But both herons separated, dodging at incredible speeds. The demons chased his future self, but he easily stopped them, deploying his gravitational territory ability, creating a barrier that trapped them. Then he unleashed a series of circles of space magic that pulverized the monsters instantly. "Come on, I'm your opponent," he shouted, mocking the creatures in the meantime. Naruto launched himself towards the Soul Reaper with some smaller monsters following closely, although his future self eliminated them before they could reach him. In addition, it activated an accelerated field ability, increasing Naruto's speed, allowing them to close the distance quickly. "Damn lowlife," cried the Soul Reaper, charging his scythe with dark energy and throwing it at Naruto, but he, unflinching, retaliated, died and launched the attack. The Reaper tried to stop him using his Cursed Dimension ability, but Naruto was effortlessly destroyed, leaving the monster stunned. When Naruto got close enough, the furious Reaper released a cloud of poisonous smoke, but Naruto decided he didn't have time for subtleties anymore. He took the most direct route and delivered a deadly blow to the Reaper's heart, knowing it was his weak point. The two engaged in a fierce battle of swords and magical attacks until Naruto managed to pierce the Reaper's side with his Meteor Chaos ability. The monster screamed in pain, but before Naruto could sing victory, the Reaper launched a counterattack with his Cursed Edge ability, creating 3 simultaneous slashes. With his scythe, Naruto was caught coughing up blood. Although seriously injured, he activated his Avatar Repeat ability, creating a copy of himself to share the damage and be able to continue fighting. Gathering all his strength, Naruto launched himself once again towards the Reaper. He had achieved the impossible. With all his strength concentrated on the attack, Naruto managed to plunge his sword into what he believed was the creature's heart. The Soul Hawk screamed in pain, making Naruto think that he had managed to defeat him. The creature smiled at him, though, sending a chill through his body. It was then that he noticed with horror that the Soul Hawk had no heart before he could react. The creature split it in 2.1, its fast, brutal move from the future. Alarmed, he shouted her name, but the Soul Hawk laughed. Did they really think my weak point was my heart? He scoffed, revealing that one of the tricks of the underworld gods was the falsification of weak points, A deception for his cursed human enemies. The creature spat with contempt. Haruto's body fell to the ground, split in two, while the Soulhawk laughed loudly. "Now there's only you left," he said in a tone of triumph, addressing his future version of the future. Even in a state of disbelief, he muttered under his breath that it couldn't be possible. He desperately tried to decipher what the monster's real weakness might be. "A god has no weaknesses," cried the Soulhawk, "and if he had one, he would be something like the very concept behind his existence, the forbidden crown of Hades." He then ordered his monsters to attack the future version of Haruto. Mocking the idea that he could beg for mercy, but with his surprising calm from the future, he commented that he had already heard everything, and indicated to Haruto that they now knew what they should do. Suddenly, Haruto appeared behind the Soul Sparrow, his sword aimed directly at the creature's head. "I have it," he said coldly. The Soulhawk, utterly bewildered, shouted that it was impossible. Only moments before he had split it in two. Haruto explained that what he had cut was nothing more than a duplicate. The moment the creature had struck him, Haruto had used his avatar replay ability to create a double and send him to the front, while the real Haruto remained hidden on the ground. Still confused, the Soul Sparrow protested that Haruto should have died after receiving a direct blow from his divine scythe. Naruto nodded, acknowledging that it had indeed been a fatal wound. However, his future self had cast on the ability to go back in time. Just before it fell, time had rewound into his body, saving him at the last moment. His future self added that although the ability was extremely complex and could not be used twice on the same target, his plan had worked perfectly. The Soulhawk tried to catch him, but his future self activated the level 78 detention chain, immobilizing the creature. "Should we set the stage for the final act?" his future self asked calmly. Haruto then addressed the Soulhawk, and confirmed that he had mentioned that his weak point was the crown on his head. His future self added that they would completely destroy that creepy head and reduce it to rubble. Haruto exhaled deeply, remembering the face of his younger sister Ria, thanking her for everything, and telling her that she loved him. This memory ignited his spirit, giving him the strength he needed. With renewed determination, he unleashed all his power and with a single devastating blow decapitated the Soulhawk. Then he jumped into the air and, moving at incredible speed, dismembered the monster's head into small fragments. The head disappeared completely, and the creature's body collapsed to the ground. Defeated with his death, the little monsters around him also vanished. Haruto landed on the ground again while the system displayed a message. "Have you defeated the god of the underworld? Soul Sparrow. You gained 120,000 experience points, and 35,000 credits." Later, he informed his future self that the extermination was complete. At that moment, a staircase appeared that led to the top floor. His future self told him that it was finally time to leave, and Haruto nodded, walking towards him with a hint of concern. Haruto looked at his older version and asked, "Yes. This is what he would look like when his future self aged." In a joking tone, he replied, "I'm going to hit you." Haruto clarified that he meant that it would have been better if his future self had appeared to help. From the beginning, as they began to climb the stairs, his future self reminded him that this intervention was only a last resort, and that there was much more to it than meets the eye. Then he cut off the conversation abruptly, warning that they didn't have much time left before the whole temporal space opened. Taking his hand firmly, he told her seriously that they must hurry. When they reached the top floor of the Sky Castle dungeon, they found themselves surrounded by thick fog. His future self looked up quickly, and shouted to Naruto that he was there. They both watched in amazement as the sky began to crack and explode with energy. In the midst of the chaos, a small figure floated. It was his little sister Ria. His future self told Naruto that the hole would remain connected to that world for another 9 minutes and 48 seconds, so they shouldn't rush as they floated towards the hole. Suddenly, his future self remembered something and activated the accelerated field ability, creating circles of energy. As he quickly ascended, Naruto shouted at him and together they hurried up. As they approached the hole, Naruto called Ria. She opened her eyes when she saw him, extending her hand as he shouted that he was right there, but her future self asked her to calm down, explaining that the inside of the hole, time-space, was disconnected from the causal principles of the world, which meant that only time-space magic would be effective. His future self entered the hole, telling Naruto that he would use time-space magic to push Ria out, and asked him to be ready to catch her by placing himself behind Ria. His future self gathered all his power, time-space in both hands, pushing with all his strength to get her out of the hole. Ria edged closer to the edge as Naruto, his vision clouded, strained to see her. Clearly she called him big brother, but to her horror the hole began to close. Naruto, in a state of shock, shouted at his future self asking what was going on. His future self replied, equally surprised, that it was too soon for the hole to begin to close. Panic gripped them both as the hole shrank rapidly, putting Ria in danger of being trapped. Desperate, his future self used all his remaining energy to keep the hole open, screaming for Naruto to get Ria out as soon as possible. Naruto, determined, answered with a yes, and used his own magic, temporal space, to bring her closer. Ria approached the edge as she fled from the future, struggling to keep the hole open. He reminded Naruto that if Ria's body got caught in the closure of the hole, it would be shattered. Even if she came out unharmed, she would fall to the ground and die if he didn't. Naruto concentrated, assured him that he understood. Finally, Ria came out of the hole and began to fall. She extended her hand toward him and he did the same, managing to grab her and pull her closer. Then he shouted at his future self to come back quickly, but there was no answer. Confused, Naruto asked what was going on and urged his future self to return to his future self. However, he smiled at her and said, "This is where we say goodbye." Naruto, puzzled, asked him what his future self meant. He explained that he had reached his limit, and that he could no longer maintain that shape. He added that he had exhausted all the Cronies factors stored within him with his last act, and had no power to return from whence he came. Naruto tried to speak, but his future self interrupted him by calling him by name seriously. He told her he hadn't been a good disciple. He complained often. He made stupid mistakes, and when he seemed to show signs of growth, his emotions made him retreat, leading him to more failures. But despite all that, he had no regrets for having fought by his side, because Naruto was a humane and kind person. His future self then informed him that the time-space hole would never open again, and that would be his final farewell. Naruto, devastated, shouted to wait for him, insisting that it couldn't be happening. But his future self trusted him with his hopes, telling him to save his world for him. Naruto, with his teeth clenched in pain, accepted with tears in his eyes, promising to take responsibility. His future self laughed softly, reminding him that this was a promise, turning to Ria. Her future self assured her that she was safe now by calling her young lady. However, Ria asked him if he could also be her brother. This question startled his future self, and he remembered how warm and charming and sweet it had been real. With him, smiling gently, she welcomed him home. Then, when the space-time hole finally closed, Naruto's future self disappeared with him. When the hole completely vanished, Naruto put his hand to his chest, feeling deep agony. And he screamed loudly, mourning the loss of someone so important to him. At that moment, Naruto had triumphed, but he had also experienced a devastating loss. The next day, after completing the Sky Castle dungeon in Tokyo Tower, Haruto entered his classroom in the high school division of the Adventurer Training Agency. To his surprise, the girls in the class ran towards him excitedly telling him that they had been waiting for him. Confused, he noticed that even his third-year classmates were present. One of the girls stepped forward and on behalf of the Ryuga Victims Association expressed her most sincere gratitude. Along with all the other girls who also thanked him, the girls started talking about how relieved they were, that the infamous sexual harasser Ryuga had been defeated and that they would no longer have to cry in their sleep. One of the girls pointed him out, calling him her savior, and wondered who had given him the nickname of God of Plagues. Haruto, uncomfortable, timidly asked them to stop, thinking to himself that he just wanted to lead a quiet and peaceful life. Suddenly someone approached and Haruto. He was surprised to see that it was Yusuke. She bowed to him and told him that as a student council representative, she wanted to apologize for the incident involving the president. He reassured her, saying that there was no need to worry, since it had nothing to do with her, but she insisted that she couldn't let it go, especially since she would soon be the new student council president. Looking directly at him, Yusuke asked him if he would like to help the school from the inside, leaving him confused. She explained that she was recruiting people for the student council, and asked him to guide the students as the leader of the magic security of the council. The entire class was excited when they heard his proposal, but Haruto declined, explaining that he was fine as he was, and that he preferred not to accept what left Yusuke in a state of shock. Then Yusuke grabbed his hand, begging him to accept, saying he would do anything if he did. Ring was incredulous. She couldn't believe that Yusuke was approaching Haruto like that and called his name, stuttering in surprise. Akin tried to reassure Ring that he was fine. One of the girls reminded Yusuke that class was about to begin and gently pushed her away from Haruto. Before leaving, Yusuke shouted that he would continue the conversation during recess and ordered him to stay in the classroom. Citing his new authority as student council president, Naruto sighed and scratched his head in exasperation. During my lunch break, I was on the roof sitting on a bench while I checked the system. He noticed that his level was 98. Rank side, the system recommended that he rise to the rank of adventurer. His abilities included fencing at level 64 and space-time magic at level 82, with very high overall stats. He also saw that he had acquired 5 new spells and thought that with those stats he felt invincible. Not surprising considering the number of enemies he had defeated. He was surprised to see that his total credits added up to 4,300,000 on 1, a figure far higher than what any high school student should have. While eating a hamburger, he heard the noise of people rushing towards the roof. Yusuke burst in, asking aloud where the girls who had started looking for him without success were. Frustrated, she reminded them that she had told Haruto he would stay in his classroom. They decided to check the gym next and left without noticing his presence. While he ate quietly and watched them go as they jumped down, Haruto knew that he had to devise a plan to handle situations like this, or it would be difficult for him to move forward. Then he turned on the bench to ask his future self for advice, but when he looked he realized he was no longer there. The memory of the absence of his older self hit him again. After classes, Haruto returned to his apartment carrying a bag of food. He went upstairs and typed the code on the door. When he opened it, he was stunned to hear Ria scream that he was late, and that she had been waiting for him for a long time. Then she greeted him sweetly home, to which he smiled and responded, "Your big brother, close." Ria proudly showed him the meal she had prepared and declared that it was a homemade dinner from her lovely sister, leaving him astonished. Then, noticing the bag in her hand, she asked if she had bought anything at the store. He realized that he had done it out of habit. Ria scolded him gently, telling him to avoid buying unnecessary things on his own. He felt her recognizing his point. She reminded him that from now on they would live together and would need to save. Surprised by this revelation, he accepted by promising to do so. Ria approached him, smiled softly, and once again welcomed him home, He was stunned for a moment. The memory of his future, welcoming him to Ria, returned to his mind. He smiled and told her, "It's good to be home." He placed the plastic bag on the table. When Ria remembered something before dinner, they both approached the family photo. Ria thanked her parents for raising them and begged her to continue taking care of them, which made him smile warmly at her sister. Then Ria noticed the scarf he had made for her. "I couldn't believe he'd kept it all this time," and he replied, "Of course I did." She reminded him that it was June, the middle of summer, but he played and told her that it was very chilly, as she knew. After changing clothes, they both sat down at the table. Ria proudly presented the food as her home cooking. He smiled, thanked her for the meal, and took a bite. She asked him eagerly what he thought. He replied that it was absolutely delicious. Ria still couldn't believe that she was really back and asked if she was really home. He reassured her by saying yes, that she was really home. He also mentioned that he had submitted the necessary documentation to the government, reporting that his little sister was in fact alive. She thanked him and mentioned that she had lost 2 years and needed to get her studies back. Haruto added that this included his dance academy. Worried, I asked if it would be financially possible. He told her not to worry about it, not now or ever again. Even in the very distant future, she joked that she might attend the dance academy even after becoming a grandmother. Ria laughed and asked what that meant. Then he looked to his side and looked at the teddy bear, wondering if it was true that it was all because of the future version of him. Haruto confirmed this by saying that they did indeed have a lot to be grateful for. Then he remembered his future self and the trust he had given him to save the world, making him stare at the bear. Wondering how he should proceed at that moment, Ria remembered something in his pocket. She remembered that it was inside her clothes when he rescued her, took out a small shiny bucket and asked her if she knew it was Naruto. He was surprised to see that it was a message bucket. As soon as he activated it, the cube emitted a bright light and his teddy bear, now possessed by the essence of his future self, appeared, leaving him stunned. His future self began speaking through the stuffed animal, saying that if Haruto was seeing that message, it meant he was no longer in the world. He also guessed that Haruto was probably feeling lost, wondering how exactly he would save the world now that his future self was gone. Haruto listened in disbelief as he fled from the future, confidently explaining that being the strongest and unparalleled warrior, he had made the necessary preparations in case something like this happened later. With a touch of arrogance, his future self asked if Haruto agreed that he was absolutely incredible and told him to feel free to offer him some praise. Haruto couldn't help but think that his future self shouldn't be so cocky. Even in a message, his future self got serious, informing him that he would transfer a letter from the future version 2 to his storage. She urged him to trust her to save the world and called him savior, asking him if he understood. Then the message cube shut down, transferring the letter to become a temporal space wizard version 2 to its storage. The system appeared in front of him, showing a message from his future self. It reminded him not to relax just because it was not there to watch him. Seeing his future self in the system lifted his spirits and he smiled. Ria, upon noticing his reaction, asked him if people were really calling him Salvador and commented how cool he sounded. He shrugged and replied that it was nothing, just the result of several things that had aligned. Meanwhile, at the headquarters of the Adventurer Guild, a meeting was being held on the top floor where the 7 rank-wise adventurers were located. The head of the Minato Kirigane branch, also known as Iron, he addressed the group. He suggested that they move on to the next item on the agenda, the eradication of the chaotic dragon in the Nakano train yard, the unauthorized entry into the Shinjuku branch synthesis facilities, which were restricted to higher-ranking adventurers, and the unauthorized looting of the Sky Castle dungeon in Tokyo Tower. He emphasized that these 3 crimes that occurred in the last few days were most likely perpetrated by the same person, and that they should identify the culprit immediately. The 5th sage, known as the King of Kings Tantalem, responded by questioning whether the dungeon in the Castle of Heaven had really been properly investigated, as it could be equivalent to a rank dungeon. The 2nd sage Platinum, also known as the Messenger of the Oracles. He asked if a single intruder had really managed to ransack such a dungeon. The 6th sage Kuryu Miramasa, known as the Exalted Magic Swordsman, replied that it seemed impossible. The 3rd sage Tiftanus remained silent throughout the discussion. The 1st sage Q, known as the UFO Elemental, commented that such actions could be seen as a challenge to the authority of the Adventurers Guild, which he found quite interesting. The 4th wise Sidon, also known as the Psychic Witch, laughed and wondered what kind of darkness might harbor the perpetrator. Finally, the 7th sage Delirium, known as Akashic Vision, declared that an observation objective had been acquired. Kureka then addressed the group, stating that he believed the 7 wise men understood the gravity of the current situation. He proposed that as soon as they identified the unknown adventurer, they should recruit him to join the guild's executive staff and prepare him to serve as a warrior in the next interdimensional war. With that, Kurigan declared the meeting of the 7 wise men concluded the next day. On a quiet street, a mother and her son were walking happily together. The mother was distracted by the beautiful flowers growing on the side of the road, while the boy was captivated by a brightly colored blue butterfly. He began to chase her without his mother noticing. Running towards the road, a truck was speeding toward her and the driver screamed in Zoka. Seeing the girl on her way, the mother heard the truck's horn and, horrified, saw her daughter in the middle of the road. He ran to his little girl, but it was too late as the truck was about to run over her. The girl's balloons flew through the air and the scene was on the verge of tragedy. But in an instant Aruto appeared, standing in front of the mother and holding the child securely in his arms. The mother was stunned, unable to comprehend what had just happened. When she confirmed that the girl was really her daughter, she ran towards them with tears running down her face. Aruto gently asked the girl if she was afraid and reassured her by telling her not to worry because she was safe now. He gently put her on the floor and the little girl thanked her mother. She immediately hugged the girl, screaming how relieved she was that her daughter was safe. Naruto smiled thinking about how he had managed to save the girl just in time. When he first saw her, he feared he wouldn't make it in time, but thanks to his temporal space magic, he made it. Although the girl's balloon and her drink were sacrificed in the process, it was a small price to pay for saving a life. He clenched his fist, feeling a satisfaction at using his powers for good. The mother looked at him and told him that she would come back to thank him properly, but Haruto dismissed him, telling him that it was not necessary. She insisted that such an act could not go unnoticed and that she should at least tell him his name. However, Haruto politely declined, saying that she should forget everything that happened, since she did not want to stand out more than she already did. Taking his school bag, he informed them that he had to leave, making his mother scream asking him to wait. But he shot out at great speed, knowing he would be late if he didn't hurry. A moment later, he arrived at the secondary division of the Adventurer Cultivation Agency. He jumped from building to building until he landed safely on the roof of his classroom while looking down. He gave the student council gathered at the entrance, wondering among themselves if they had seen Naruto sighed in frustration and headed to his room, but he couldn't help but notice the murmurs and looks of his classmates. He felt uncomfortable, thinking he didn't need to use his time flow ability to know he was being watched. Meanwhile, Flynn watched him from one side, feeling as if he were slipping out of his grasp. So it had been the time I'd found him. After leaving the Adventurers Guild, he recalled a moment in the Shinjuku Metropolitan Government Office branch of the Adventurers Guild. There he had introduced himself as a student from the cultivation agency school in Nakano district, reporting that he had completed an exploration of a rank V dungeon. The man, at the counter, thanked him for his hard work and, as he was preparing to leave, I suddenly asked him if a student named Aruto attended his school. Surprised, she replied that she did indeed know a student by that name. The man explained that Takamune of the Weapons Synthesis Laboratory had developed a new theory of weapon synthesis based on something called the Kaju theory. He added that when I asked Takamune about it, he mentioned that a student of Nekanu had given him a clue that helped him develop the theory. The man commented that it sounded pretty far-fetched. Ryan watched Aruto, wondering how far he would go after class. The professor dismissed them in the morning, reminding them about the student exchange that would join them next week. During the lunch break, Aruto was back on the rooftop reviewing the messages his future self had left for him. One of the messages was activated with his future self advising him that he will first perfect his skills as a swordsman. In the end, the message said that space-time magic was only a kind of auxiliary and supportive magic. His true talent lay in his sword, and if he wanted to become a great space-time wizard like himself, he had to live first by and for the sword. There will be a time when you will understand why I was telling you this, but for now that was all. The message disappeared and Aruto leaned back on the bench, thinking of how cryptic his future self had always been. He wished he could explain things more clearly. Elsewhere, someone strong had come to his school. The man used his stealth and lightning stride abilities to magically close the distance as he moved. Aruto was surprised to feel his presence, and when he looked back, he saw a man appear on the roof. Instinctively, Aruto took his sword from his storage and stood to face the man, demanding to know who the man was, who was none other than Kuryu Muramasa, the sixth, wise and exalted magical swordsman, asked Aruto if he was the anonymous and declared that he wanted to borrow his strength. Muramasa looked at him seriously and said, "The destruction of the world is almost upon us." Haruto realized that he hadn't felt Muramasa's presence until he was right in front of him. He was no ordinary person. He asked Muramasa if he really meant the destruction of the world, and what he meant exactly. Muramasa replied, "What exactly did it look like in the near future?" Everything Haruto cherished would be reduced to nothing and disappear. This surprised Haruto, who immediately thought of Ria, pointed his sword at Muramasa, stating that he could not simply believe such a statement, especially since he did not know who Muramasa was or what kind of person he might be. He added that Muramasa had suddenly appeared and started making statements that he could only interpret as coercive, reminding someone of his future self, whom he did not particularly like. Haruto stated that he would behave according to his own independent thoughts and make his own decisions. Muramasa smiled at this and took out a photo, asking Haruto if he still felt the same way. After seeing it, Haruto was upset when he realized that the image was of Ria practicing dance. In a fit of anger, he unleashed a powerful aura, surprising Muramasa. It wasn't just a fighting spirit, anyone that was one abnormal, however. Muramasa recognized that Haruto had the characteristics of a true swordsman. Haruto assured that he had only taken the photo as part of a background check and that he had not touched his sister. Then Muramasa drew his sword, swearing by the name of his swordmaster, that he meant no harm. He walked quickly beside Haruto, adding that if he needed a fight to convince him with pleasure, he would. This only infuriated Haruto further, who told Muramasa that he had crossed the line. Muramasa backed away, warning Haruto that what happened next should not be regretted. Later, as they prepared to fight, Muramasa used his murderous intent ability. Naruto was surprised to see that there was no Croon's factor around Muramasa, which meant he couldn't see the flow of time. Noticing Haruto's silence, Muramasa asked if there was something wrong and told him to be ready or not come towards him. Muramasa disappeared into a blur and reappeared right in front of Haruto, leaving him stunned. He explained that his murderous intention did not mean revealing his intentions to kill, but quite the opposite, it meant eliminating his own aura or presence. Muramasa then swung his sword at Naruto, who barely managed to jump, spin in the air and evade the attack. Naruto realized that Muramasa's murderous intention was to eliminate the Crun's factor from his immediate environment. Naruto asked Muramasa because he was explaining how his abilities worked, joking about whether he was a half-dumb villain from a manga. Muramasa calmly replied that he was telling him because he could still win. Even after revealing his secrets, he explained that by eliminating his presence he could take the initiative over his opponent. Suddenly, Muramasa appeared behind Naruto without him noticing. When Naruto turned to face him, Muramasa swung his sword, managing to cut him. Muramasa smiled thinking he had won, but to his surprise, Naruto's figure began to slowly fade. He had been a clone created using his avatar replay ability. The real Naruto appeared behind Muramasa and swung his sword down. But Muramasa ducked in time to dodge the attack, wondering what was happening. Frustrated for not landing the blow, Naruto watched as Muramasa jumped back to create distance. Muramasa, still confused, realized that he should definitely have cut Naruto off and wondered if he was more than just an after-emir. As Muramasa stood up, 2 buttons fell from his coat due to the force of Naruto's previous attack. Taking advantage of the moment, Naruto used his quick body ability to rush towards Muramasa at great speed, by swinging his Muramasa sword, recognizing the power he possessed. Naruto smiled, thinking this was getting interesting. Muramasa blocked Naruto's sword with his own and the force between his weapons caused sparks. Muramasa looked at Naruto and asked what Naruto would do next. Realizing that he could not trust to see the flow of time, he decided to use a different technique. He pushed Muramasa's sword slightly, and activated his arrest chain ability, which immobilized Muramasa and his sword. Muramasa was surprised to find himself restrained. Naruto gathered some power in his fist and Muramasa. He was even more surprised when Naruto leaned to the side and threw a punch using his Chrono Fist ability. Stunned for a moment, Muramasa dropped his sword and managed to activate his Steel Body ability. Just in time, Naruto's punch collided with Muramasa, causing a loud explosion between them and sending Muramasa flying. Although he remained unharmed, Muramasa marveled at the power of Naruto's attack, realizing it wasn't just a random punch. Then he looked at Naruto, recognizing him as an awakened one. Naruto cursed in frustration. Realizing that even his last attack had been ineffective, he was confused when Muramasa suddenly suggested that they stop. Muramasa walked calmly towards Naruto, sincerely apologizing for what he had said. He bowed deeply, apologizing for his willful invasion, and vowing never to do such a thing again. Naruto was stunned and asked what was happening. Muramasa simply grabbed his sword, and declared that he would leave now. Naruto shouted after him, demanding to know why he was making that decision alone and insisting that his fight was not over. Muramasa replied that of course he was not decided and that they should continue at his school. Naruto, more confused than ever, asked what he meant by his school. Muramasa explained that Naruto had a unique talent, but he was still too weak and had not reached the level he desired. He suggested that they learn the mysteries of the sword at his school to help Naruto become stronger. Naruto remembered the message from his future self, which told him that his true talent lay in the sword, and that if he wanted to become a great space-time mage, he must first live for the sword. She reminded Muramasa that she still couldn't trust him like that. Muramasa agreed, but pointed out that at this moment he was definitely stronger than Naruto. Asking if that wasn't reason enough, then she told him she would wait for him at his school before disappearing. Confused, Naruto felt something in his pocket and took out an exchange student permit between his school and Azabo's school. He realized that Muramasa must have slipped it into his pocket during their fight. Understanding that Muramasa was referring to Azabo as his school, Naruto thought furiously that Muramasa definitely knew how to bring out the worst in him. Meanwhile, Muramasa was at the school entrance adjusting his coat. He thought to himself that Haruto was the real deal. Before the seven sages had a chance to use Haruto as a disposable pawn, Muramasa was determined to train him well. Then, once Haruto joined the seven sages, he would help him overthrow them and seize their power. Muramasa silently swore to thwart Kirigane's plans on the rooftop. Naruto examined the exchange student permit. He said the goal was to improve the true strength of the adventurers in each school. The duration was listed as July 1 to 13, 2054. Application requirements included being a student enrolled in a school affiliated with the Adventurer Cultivation Agency, with student council members, receiving degree treatment and benefits at the exchange school while studying. Yuzuki suddenly burst onto the roof shouting that she had found him, and that he would finally join her student council. Naruto stood up saying that his timing was perfect, and told Yuzuki that he was inside. She froze in astonished surprise that he had actually agreed to join the student council. A week later, at the Azabu branch of the Adventurer Cultivation Agency, Haruto was walking with Yuzuki. She expressed how impressed she was, not only that he had joined the student council, but also that he wanted to accompany her to Asabu's school as an exchange student. He replied that it was the least he could do as a member of the council, although in truth he was motivated mainly by the benefits mentioned in the document. Yuzuki explained that the Asabu school was known for producing many Sai-rank adventurers and was considered the best education and training institution in Japan. He added that it was a super elite school that required a magical deviation value of over 70 for admission. Before entering the building, Yuzuki turned to him excitedly, encouraging him to do his best not to be left behind, stammering in agreement. Feeling a little overwhelmed as they entered and found themselves in a huge hall, Yuzuki suggested that they greet the board president first. As they walked through the living room, Haruto noticed that the students inside were looking at them curiously, wondering where those two strangers had come from, but he decided not to worry about that and resolved to move at his own pace. Yuzuki, noticing his discomfort, stammered to him that there was no reason to be afraid because she was there with him. He agreed, but he couldn't help but wonder if Yuzuki would really be okay in that place. On the 20th floor they arrived at the office of the chairman of the board. Yuzuki pointed it out and Haruto knocked on the door. When he entered, Muramasa was sitting in the center of the room. Waiting for them, he introduced himself as the president of the school, leaving Haruto in disbelief that this was really Muramasa's school. Muramasa stood up and welcomed them to Azabu's school, explaining that in these times when mages were in their golden age, the school specialized strictly in cultivating fencing. Even within the Adventurer Cultivation Agency, they were unique. He added that instead of magic duels, sword duels were held, and during the exchange student program he hoped that they would rise to the top of the school rankings through duels. Naruto was surprised when Muramasa pointed it out directly, but before he could react, Yuzuki told Muramasa to wait a moment, insisting that none of that was supposed to be part of the exchange program activities. However, Haruto asked Muramasa if he could fight him again if he participated, leaving Yuzuki confused and stammering, asking what he meant by again. Muramasa explained that the student who reaches first place in the rankings gets the right to challenge the strongest individual in the school from excited Azabu Haruto. He stated that that was exactly what he wanted to hear and that he intended to climb to the top and defeat Muramasa as quickly as possible so that he could return home. Before what left Yuzuki in a state of panic, Naruto told Muramasa that his only complaint was that their previous fight was half over and that once they resolved it he would have no reason to stay. Muramasa replied that he had no problem with that and that the school respected any swordsman who aspired to be the best, regardless of his attitude or posture. Muramasa then opened a system and provided them with student IDs and school class schedules, explaining that with this they could access the school's facilities and equipment while enjoying greater benefits. As members of the student council, Naruto saw that his adventurer level in the fencing course was 98, placing him at position 4395th out of 14,000, in the Azabu school ranking with access to greater privileges. He wondered if the ranking system worked the same as Nakano's, weighing whether he should challenge the highest-ranked students one after another to move up quickly. After solving everything, Muramasa wished them success and said goodbye as they walked down the corridor. Yuzuki exclaimed that the situation was absurd, asking how he was supposed to aspire to the top of the Naruto school rankings. "Did you agree?" Telling her that there was no need for the newly appointed Madam President to do that in the first place. He then thought about the fastest way to advance the rankings, considering places where high-ranking students could gather, such as special lecture classrooms, student council rooms, dual arenas, martial arts club building, classroom building, cafeteria, event hall, and even the board president's office. With a determined smile, Naruto decided to visit those places. Well,